I never imagined that the desert would become both my refuge and my greatest source of mystery. My name is Jordan Rivera, and I once prided myself on being a firm believer in science, a geologist and amateur photographer whose worldview was built entirely on facts, measurements, and the quiet certainty of physical laws. But after years of being trapped in a corporate job that stifled my creativity and drained my spirit, I finally reached a breaking point. I craved inspiration, a new beginning away from the suffocating hum of city life, and something in me whispered that the rugged landscape of Sedona, Arizona, held secrets that could reawaken my soul. So I left behind the sterile confines of boardrooms and endless cubicles, and set out to build an off-grid adobe retreat on the red-hued hills outside Sedona, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe ancient energy. The journey to my new home was an awakening in itself. As I drove through the vast desert, the horizon stretched endlessly before me, a canvas painted in deep reds and burnt oranges. The sun, relentless in its brilliance, scorched the cracked earth, while distant mesas and buttes jutted upward like the remnants of a forgotten civilization. I remember pulling over at a lookout point, stepping out of the car, and feeling the heat radiate from the land. It was both intimidating and invigorating. The desert demanded respect, and I welcomed that challenge. My new adobe retreat was modest but full of character. Constructed with sun-baked bricks and built into the side of a hill, the home blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. I spent the first few days renovating and personalizing the space, patching up cracks in the walls, repainting the interior in soft, neutral tones, and setting up a small studio where I could develop my photographs. Solar panels adorned the roof, a testament to my commitment to living off the grid, even as they struggled at times under the relentless sun. I also installed a rainwater collection system, though the sporadic desert rains made that a constant challenge. The isolation was exhilarating. Every morning, I woke to a panorama of red rock formations and sweeping vistas that no one else could ever claim as their own. It wasn't long before I discovered that this place was more than just a pretty face. On my very first night in the desert, as twilight descended and the scorching heat gave way to a bone-chilling cold, I found myself sitting on the worn wooden steps of my porch, a cup of weak coffee warming my hands. The sky exploded with stars, a brilliance that dwarfed anything I'd ever seen in the city. In that stillness, the silence of the desert was punctuated by a subtle, almost imperceptible murmur. At first, I dismissed it as the wind weaving through the crevices of my adobe walls, but as I listened more closely, it sounded oddly rhythmic, like a chant from a language I didn't know, a murmur that seemed to echo from the very rocks themselves. The following morning, I set out with my camera, determined to capture the desert's raw beauty, and, perhaps, the source of that strange sound. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with vast expanses of red sandstone punctuated by sparse clusters of scrub oak and yucca. I wandered through narrow canyons and along rocky trails, snapping photos of curious formations and patterns in the earth. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something unsettling. There were markings on the rocks that hadn't been there before, or at least that I hadn't seen. At first, I assumed they were natural weathering or the result of erosion, but closer inspection revealed them to be deliberate carvings, etched into the stone in a series of symbols that seemed to shift in appearance as I moved. It was as if the carvings were alive, their forms subtly altering with the play of light and shadow. That evening, I returned to my retreat with my mind buzzing with questions. I loaded my camera with fresh film and began to review the images I'd taken, hoping that the truth would reveal itself in the details. At first glance, the photographs were stunning, sharp, vivid details of the red rock and endless sky. But then I noticed something I couldn't explain. In several shots, barely visible in the background, were figures that resembled human silhouettes. They were not clear or defined, just faint outlines that seemed to hover among the rocks. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if my imagination was playing tricks on me in the fading light. Yet, when I zoomed in on the images, the forms persisted. Shadowy shapes that had no logical explanation. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mix of excitement and dread stirring in my chest. Determined to make sense of these inexplicable occurrences, I reached out to Mia, a free-spirited artist and longtime friend who had always been fascinated by the mystical qualities of the desert. Mia had moved to Sedona several years earlier, drawn by the vibrant energy and the rich tapestry of Native American lore that permeated the region. When I told her about the carvings and the ghostly figures in my photographs, her eyes lit up with a mix of curiosity and concern. She insisted that I visit a local shaman she knew, a quiet, enigmatic man who had spent decades studying the ancient traditions of the Navajo and Hopi peoples. He was said to possess knowledge of the desert's hidden forces, including the legends of skinwalkers and desert spirits. Though skeptical by nature, I agreed that perhaps a broader perspective was needed. After all, I was beginning to question the limits of my own rationality. A week later, Mia and I drove together along a dusty, winding road toward a small, unassuming settlement where the shaman lived. The journey took us deep into the heart of the desert, far from the tourist traps and commercialized spirituality that often characterized Sedona's outskirts. The air was dry, and the heat shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. At last, we arrived at a humble dwelling made of adobe and wood, set against the backdrop of towering red rocks. The shaman, a quiet, weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, greeted us with a nod. Over a simple meal of corn and beans, he listened intently as Mia and I recounted the strange events at my retreat, the shifting carvings, the whispering winds, and the shadowy figures in my photographs. He spoke in measured tones, his voice low and resonant, explaining that the desert was a living, breathing entity with its own memory. According to him, the land had been witness to countless rituals, sacrifices, and acts of love and violence, and its spirit was both guardian and avenger. He mentioned that skinwalkers, shapeshifters of Native American lore, were said to roam these barren lands, taking on forms that could blur the line between man and beast. They were believed to be creatures of both protection and malevolence, drawn to the energy of the land and the emotions of those who dwelled upon it. The shaman warned me that I might have inadvertently disturbed a sacred balance by settling in an area where the old ways still resonated strongly. He suggested that the shifting symbols on the rocks were perhaps messages, warnings or invitations from the spirit world, and that the ghostly figures in my photographs were not merely hallucinations of light and shadow, but glimpses into another realm. I left the shaman's dwelling with a heavy mind and an even heavier heart. His words mingled with my own scientific skepticism, challenging me to consider that perhaps the desert was far more mysterious than I had ever allowed myself to believe. That night, as I sat on the worn wooden steps of my adobe retreat, the desert sky unfurled above me in a tapestry of shimmering stars, and I listened again to the murmuring wind. It was almost as if the rocks themselves were speaking, their voices blending with the rustle of the sparse vegetation. I wondered if the carvings would change again by morning, if the spectral figures would become clearer or vanish entirely. Sleep eluded me, and in the darkness I felt as though I were suspended between two worlds, the one of hard, unyielding geology, and the other of ethereal myth. Over the following weeks, the phenomena grew increasingly persistent and, at times, aggressive. I began to notice that the eerie carvings on the rocks were not static. They shifted gradually, sometimes aligning in patterns that resembled ancient script, other times breaking apart into chaotic, almost desperate shapes. I took to recording these changes in a leather-bound journal, sketching the symbols by hand and annotating each detail with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Every time I ventured out with my camera, I felt that I was being drawn into a silent dialogue with the desert, a conversation that I struggled to understand but could not ignore. The nights, however, were when the true terror began. One evening, after a particularly sweltering day when the heat had warped the air into a shimmering haze, I returned to my retreat to find the temperature had plunged abruptly. The desert, known for its dramatic swings between scorching day and frigid night, seemed even more unpredictable now. I sat on my back porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to quell the chill that had seeped into my bones. The wind carried with it a series of low, guttural sounds, a deep, almost rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. It wasn't the whisper of the wind, but a sound that resonated in my chest, a call that felt both ancient and urgent. I tried to rationalize it away as nothing more than a natural phenomenon, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, as night deepened. I stepped inside, turning on every light I had, but the darkness outside seemed to press in on the windows, as if daring me to look. With trembling hands, I drew back the curtains and peered out into the desert night. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, shadows flitting among the rocks, figures that moved in the periphery of my vision. I couldn't tell if they were real or illusions conjured by my fevered imagination, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I confided in Mia, who had become my confidant and partner in unraveling the mysteries of this harsh land. Over a late-night phone call filled with static and the sound of wind, I recounted every detail: the shifting carvings, the ghostly figures, the eerie pulse of the earth. Mia's voice was a mixture of excitement and concern. She admitted that she too had experienced moments of inexplicable dread, a feeling that something in the desert was trying to communicate, to warn us of an ancient force stirred by our intrusion. Together, we decided to take our investigation further. We set up a series of motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of my retreat, aiming them at the rock faces where the carvings were most prominent, and along the trails where the spectral figures were rumored to appear. We also began keeping detailed logs of any anomalies, noting the time, weather conditions, and our own emotional states. The first few nights of surveillance produced nothing more than ordinary desert scenes: a tumbleweed rolling across the red sand, the quiet rustle of brush, the steady pulse of the wind. But on the fourth night, as I reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. One camera, pointed at a particularly prominent rock outcrop, had captured a series of inexplicable events. In the early hours before dawn, the rock's surface seemed to ripple, and the carvings rearranged themselves in a fluid, almost living manner. Then, in a shadow that did not belong to the rock, a figure emerged, a blurry, humanoid shape with elongated limbs and eyes that glinted like distant stars. The figure lingered for a few long seconds before dissolving into the darkness. I rewound the footage repeatedly, desperate to catch every detail, and each time the image seemed to shift imperceptibly, as if trying to hide its true nature. I showed the footage to Mia the next day, and though she tried to maintain her composure, I could hear the tremor in her voice as she insisted that we needed to understand what we were dealing with. That afternoon, we returned to the shaman's dwelling. The old man listened silently as we described the latest occurrences, nodding slowly as if confirming something he had known all along. He explained that the desert was a place where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was particularly thin, a place where the souls of ancient ones could still roam. He mentioned that the Skinwalkers, creatures of shifting form and elusive presence, were often blamed for such phenomena. According to legend, These beings could mimic the appearance of humans, even the features of those who once walked these lands, as a way of luring unsuspecting souls into the embrace of the desert's dark side. His words, delivered in a measured cadence, filled me with both dread and a strange sense of inevitability. He advised us to perform a cleansing ritual, a rite that involved burning sage, sprinkling salt around the retreat, and reciting prayers in the ancient tongue of the local tribes. He promised that this might pacify the restless energies, if only for a while. Mia and I returned to my retreat that evening with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Under the vast, star-studded sky, we gathered the ritual items and arranged them carefully on the weathered wooden table in my living room. The night air was cool, and the desert seemed to hold its breath as we began the incantation. I recited the words as best I could from memory, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides, while Mia waved bundles of sage over the adobe walls. For a moment, the desert fell silent, as though the ancient forces were listening. Then, slowly, a gentle wind stirred, carrying with it a sense of calm that had been absent for so many nights. We believed that we had, if only temporarily, restored some measure of balance to the land. Yet, even as the ritual concluded, I knew that the desert's mysteries were not so easily tamed. In the days that followed, the strange phenomena resumed with renewed vigor. The rock carvings continued to shift, and on several occasions I caught a glimpse of that elusive figure on the edges of my vision, always in the periphery, never fully in focus. The whispering winds returned, now sounding almost like faint, rhythmic chants that ebbed and flowed with the passing hours. At times, I felt a palpable pressure in the air, as if something was trying to push its way into my retreat. The nights grew longer, and with each passing one, the sense of being intruded upon by unseen presences became harder to ignore. Mia and I spent countless hours poring over the footage, trying to find a pattern or meaning in the chaotic images. We debated fiercely about whether the phenomena were real or the result of overactive imaginations exacerbated by isolation and the harsh environment. I began to document everything in a journal, a detailed account of every sound, every flicker of light, every inexplicable movement. The journal became both a scientific log and a personal testament to my struggle to understand a world that seemed to defy the logic I had once held dear. There were nights when sleep eluded me entirely, and I would lie awake in the darkness, the silence punctuated only by the distant murmur of the desert. In those moments, I felt a deep, almost overwhelming connection to the land, a sense that I was a part of something vast, timeless, and not entirely benign. The boundaries between the physical and the spiritual blurred, and I wondered if perhaps my scientific mind was being forced to confront truths that lay beyond the reach of empirical understanding. As the weeks turned into months, the desert began to reveal its dual nature to me, a harsh, unforgiving landscape that was also inexplicably beautiful and full of hidden wonder. I captured thousands of photographs, the play of light on ancient rock, the eerie silhouettes of the elusive figures, and the delicate interplay of shadow and color that transformed the barren earth into a living work of art. Each image was a reminder that, despite the terror I sometimes felt, there was a profound beauty in the chaos, a beauty that demanded both reverence and caution. Mia remained my constant companion and confidant throughout this journey, her free spirit and artistic vision helping to anchor me in moments of overwhelming uncertainty. Together, we held long conversations beneath the expansive desert sky, debating the nature of the unseen forces that haunted the land. She was unafraid to embrace the mystical, to see the intangible threads that connected the present to an ancient past, while I struggled to reconcile my scientific training with the undeniable evidence of the inexplicable. Our late-night walks became a ritual in themselves, as we followed the shifting shadows along narrow trails, occasionally stumbling upon hidden symbols carved into rocks, or finding small tokens left by unknown hands. These moments, though filled with a palpable sense of dread, also carried the promise of discovery, a promise that by understanding the mysteries of the desert, we might unlock secrets that had been buried for millennia. There were times when the encounters became so aggressive that I found myself questioning my decision to come here. One particularly sweltering night, as the temperature dipped unexpectedly and the stars emerged with an almost supernatural clarity, I heard a sound that shattered the fragile peace of my retreat. It began as a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the adobe walls, growing louder and more insistent until it seemed to come from every corner of the room. I bolted upright, heart hammering, as the sound reached a fever pitch. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the unmistakable echo of footsteps and distant, anguished cries. I rushed to the window, and in the flickering light of my security lamp, I saw a dark shape moving swiftly across the rocky outcrop. For a moment, it paused, its eyes, if they could be called that, glinting in the harsh light, before disappearing into the endless darkness of the desert. I spent the rest of the night huddled beneath layers of blankets, too terrified to sleep, convinced that something malevolent was trying to force its way into my sanctuary. In the aftermath of that night, Mia and I resolved that we could no longer simply wait for the phenomena to subside. We began to document our experiences in a more systematic fashion, setting up additional cameras and even an audio recorder to capture the subtle, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to accompany the mysterious sounds. We reached out to a few local experts, archaeologists, folklorists, and even a couple of skeptical academics who had studied the legends of the desert. While none could offer a definitive explanation, their collective insights lent weight to the idea that what we were experiencing was a convergence of ancient energy and modern intrusion. The desert, it seemed, was a place where the old ways still had power, where the spirits of long-forgotten peoples and creatures could stir in response to the presence of those who dared to disturb the delicate balance. As I sat here now, in the quiet solitude of another desert night, I can still hear the distant murmur of shifting stones and whispered voices carried on the wind. The red rocks glow softly in the pale light of the moon, and I know that the mysteries of this land are far from solved. I remain here, driven by a determination to understand and perhaps even document the inexplicable, a scientist and an artist, bound together by a shared desire to reveal the hidden depths of a world that defies simple explanation. Each day brings new revelations, and with them, new questions. But I have come to accept that in the desert, not everything is meant to be understood by the logic of reason alone. I am no longer sure whether the shadowy figures I capture with my camera are the mere trick of light and sand, or if they are real, spectral beings from an ancient past. I have learned that the desert has its own language, a language spoken in shifting symbols and whispered chants, in the timeless dance between light and darkness. And though fear still grips me on certain nights, there is also a profound sense of wonder, a recognition that I have found a place where the past and the present converge, where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blur into a continuum of beauty and mystery. Mia's presence has been a constant source of solace and insight. Together, we continue to explore the secrets of this land, unraveling its myths and documenting its hidden voices. We hold on to the hope that by understanding the energy of the desert, we might one day unlock its stories and share them with a world that is too busy to listen. For now, I remain here in Sedona, an imperfect sanctuary of adobe and sun, rock and shadow, determined to honor the land's ancient power and to forge a future built on both science and the mystical. a future where the shadows over Sedona are not feared, but understood as part of the vast, eternal tapestry of existence. I have learned that inspiration often comes at a price paid in sleepless nights, in moments of terror when the unseen nearly overpowers the rational mind. Yet, I have also learned that the desert, with all its harsh beauty and enigmatic power, can heal even the most fractured soul. I am Jordan Rivera, and I have come to believe that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only experienced and revered. As I continue my work here, I know that I will forever be changed by the whispers and the shadows, by the shifting carvings in the red rocks and the spectral figures that dance in the periphery of my vision. And in that transformation, I find a strange and enduring hope, a hope that, even in a world of relentless logic, there is room for wonder, for mystery, and for the wild, untamed spirit of the desert. I still remember the first time I saw the endless expanse of the coastal rainforest near Port Townsend, a thick tapestry of green shrouded in perpetual mist, with the rhythmic sound of the ocean crashing against rocky shores in the background. My name is Avery Monroe, and I had spent far too many years of my life trapped in a bustling city, where creativity was slowly strangled by stress and routine. I left behind the fluorescent lights and endless noise, driven by a desperate need to find solace, to write, and ultimately to heal. When I stumbled upon a secluded off-grid cottage nestled on the edge of a dense coastal forest, I knew I had found the refuge I so desperately craved. The drive up to the cottage was a journey in itself, a slow, winding road that meandered through groves of towering firs and ancient cedars, their trunks slick with rain and moss. Even during the day, a constant, gentle drizzle blurred the edges of the landscape, and by the time I arrived, the sky was a deep slate gray, hinting at the weather to come. I remember pulling up to the weathered wooden gate, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, and stepping out into a world that seemed both wild and comforting. The cottage itself was small but sturdy, its exterior painted in faded blues that had long since surrendered to the relentless Pacific rains. Ivy clung to the walls, and nearby, a tangle of driftwood lay scattered, half buried in the damp earth, a silent testament to the ceaseless power of the sea. The first few days were a whirlwind of activity, as I set about making the cottage my own. I spent hours cleaning, arranging old books I'd salvaged from the city, and setting up my modest writing space by a large, paned window that overlooked the misty shoreline. The constant patter of rain, mixed with the occasional cry of a distant gull, became the new background music to my life. Despite the isolation and the challenges of living off-grid, intermittent power from my battered solar panels, the ever-present humidity that made everything damp, I felt an exhilaration I hadn't known in years. I was finally alone with my thoughts, my words, and the ancient whispers of nature. It wasn't long before I began to notice that the forest, and indeed the entire coast, seemed to be alive with secrets. On my very first night, as I sat on the creaking wooden porch wrapped in a well-worn blanket, I listened to the symphony of sounds that only a coastal rainforest can produce. The rain was steady and unrelenting, drumming on the roof and mingling with the soft, almost indistinguishable murmur of voices carried on the ocean breeze. I dismissed it at first as nothing more than the wind. After all, the sea was known for its unpredictable temperament, but there was something uncanny about the cadence of the sounds. They rose and fell in a pattern that suggested language, as if the elements themselves were trying to communicate. I couldn't help but feel that the voices were calling to me, drawing me deeper into the mysteries of this place. The following morning, I set out for a walk along the misty shoreline. The beach was a long, curving strip of wet sand and scattered pebbles, bordered by wind-sculpted rocks and lichen-coated driftwood. The air was thick with salt and the rich, earthy scent of wet foliage. As I ambled along, my boots sinking into the soft, sodden sand, I caught glimpses of shapes in the fog, fleeting figures that darted behind clusters of sea grape and tangled kelp. At first, I assumed they were nothing more than tricks of the light and my own fatigued imagination. But, as I continued my walk, I discovered mysterious carvings etched into weathered pieces of driftwood. The marks were intricate, almost like ancient script, worn smooth by years of exposure to the relentless sea and rain. I gathered one particularly fascinating piece and tucked it into my satchel, resolved to research its meaning later. Over the next few days, I began to piece together a tentative rhythm to life in the cottage. I would rise with the subdued light of dawn, brew a strong cup of coffee, and sit at my desk, staring out the window at the endless gray horizon where the forest met the sea. The hours would pass in a blur of scribbled notes and inspired bursts of writing, interrupted occasionally by the need to tend to practical matters, fixing a leaky tap, hauling wood for the old, crackling fireplace, or checking the generator that powered my few essential appliances. Yet, amid these daily routines, the peculiar ambiance of the place grew ever more pronounced. One particularly stormy evening, as the wind whipped the rain into a frenzy and the ocean roared in the distance, I found myself unable to sleep. The incessant drumming on the roof and the creaks of the old cottage mingled with that familiar murmur, a low, rhythmic sound that now seemed unmistakably human. I rose from my bed and stepped outside into the swirling mists. The night was impenetrably dark, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning that revealed twisted silhouettes of ancient trees and the frothy turmoil of the sea. I listened intently, my breath visible in the cool, damp air, and I realized with a jolt that the voices were clearer than ever. They were soft, plaintive murmurs that almost sounded like distant singing, laced with sorrow and longing. In my restless state, I wandered down a narrow path that led from the cottage toward the shoreline. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a slick, glistening landscape, and the fog hung thick as if guarding the secrets of the night. As I drew nearer to the water, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure standing at the edge of the beach, half hidden in the haze. It was impossible to discern any features, but the form was unmistakably human, its posture upright and still. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, but the figure remained silent and unmoving. For a long, tense moment, I considered approaching, driven by a mix of fear and a desperate need to understand what I was witnessing. Yet something in the oppressive atmosphere urged caution, so I retreated slowly, making my way back to the safety of the cottage. The next morning, I mentioned the encounter to Liam, a quiet local fisherman who had become my neighbor since I arrived. Liam was a man of few words, with weathered skin and a gaze that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. He listened with a solemn expression as I recounted what I had seen, nodding slowly. "The coast holds many memories," he said in his gravelly voice. "Some say that these lands are haunted by the souls of those lost at sea, whose spirits linger among the cliffs and forests." His words, spoken with quiet conviction, unsettled me further. I asked him about the voices, the carvings on the driftwood I had collected, and the strange phenomena I had experienced. Liam's eyes darkened as he began to share the local legends, tales of ghostly mariners and ancient coastal spirits that had been passed down through generations of fishermen and seafarers. According to him, on nights when the wind was right, the souls of drowned sailors would rise from the depths, whispering their sorrow into the night, seeking redemption or perhaps a final farewell. I listened, captivated and horrified in equal measure. The more Liam spoke, the more it seemed that my experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, unfathomable tapestry of history and loss that permeated the coastal rainforest. With his guidance, I began to conduct my own small investigations. I combed through local archives at the small-town library, finding old newspaper clippings and faded photographs of shipwrecks and maritime tragedies. I learned of a particularly tragic event, a storm decades ago that had claimed the lives of several fishermen and left behind a legacy of sorrow and mystery. The more I read, the more I felt that the voices I had heard, the fleeting shapes in the mist, and the eerie carvings on driftwood were all echoes of that forgotten tragedy. One evening, emboldened by a mixture of scientific curiosity and an almost irrational need to communicate with the unseen, I decided to perform a small ritualistic act. I gathered a bundle of driftwood from the beach, lit it with an old kerosene torch, and arranged it in a rough circle on the rocky shoreline. I had read in a local lore compendium that lighting driftwood torches and reciting traditional sea chants was a way to honor the lost and perhaps soothe their tormented spirits. As the flames flickered and the smoke curled upward into the mist, I began to chant softly, reciting the words I had painstakingly memorized from an old manuscript I'd found in the local historical society's archives. At first, nothing happened, only the crackle of burning wood and the gentle rush of the tide. But as I continued, the wind seemed to shift, carrying my voice out over the dark water. For a brief moment, I thought I heard a response, a soft, resonant hum that mingled with the crashing waves. It was as if the very air was vibrating with the voices of the past, and in that moment, I felt an indescribable connection to the souls that haunted these shores. In the days that followed, the supernatural encounters grew more frequent and more intense. I began to hear the indistinct voices not only at night, but sometimes during the quiet hours of early morning, when the mist lay thick over the land. I caught sight of figures drifting along the shoreline, their forms translucent and shifting, as though they were made of the very fog itself. Each encounter sent shivers through me and raised more questions than answers. I recorded everything in a leather-bound journal, each sighting, each sound, each inexplicable phenomenon that I experienced in this strange, haunted place. Despite the growing unease, I found myself unable to leave. The cottage, with all its isolation and mysteries, had become my sanctuary, a place where I could finally pour my heart onto paper and begin to heal the wounds left by years of urban despair. I resolved to document every encounter, every murmur of the wind, and every fleeting glimpse of a spectral form, believing that through careful observation and honest record, I might one day unlock the secrets of the coastal rainforest. My nightly vigils became a ritual. I would sit on the back porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the interplay of fog and light as the tides ebbed and flowed. Sometimes, as the rain tapped softly against the wooden panels of the cottage, I would hear the softest strains of what sounded like a melody, a haunting, melancholic tune that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep in the forest or from the depths of the sea. Other times, I would see mysterious carvings reappear on pieces of driftwood freshly washed ashore, their intricate designs glowing faintly in the lantern light. In these moments, I felt both a profound sorrow and an inexplicable hope, a sense that the land was alive with memories, that the voices of the past were not meant to be silenced, but honored. Liam continued to visit regularly, always with a calm assurance that belied the gravity of the stories he told. He would sit with me for hours on the porch, his eyes fixed on the churning sea, occasionally remarking on how the wind carried the voices of long-dead sailors. "They're telling their stories," he said one particularly gloomy afternoon, his tone gentle but insistent. "Listen closely, Avery." and you might just understand what they're longing for. I often found myself nodding, even when I didn't fully comprehend his words, for there was a deep truth in the way he spoke of the coast, as though it were a living monument to both triumph and tragedy. One crisp evening, as the sky cleared briefly to reveal a scattering of stars, I decided to push further. I took my journal, my camera, and a small audio recorder, and ventured out along the rocky path that led down to a secluded cove. The cove was known among the locals as a place where the veil between the worlds was said to be thinner, a sacred spot where the souls of the lost were believed to linger. The moon was a pale crescent, and the tide was low, exposing a bed of wet, glistening rocks. I set up the recorder on a flat stone and sat down quietly, listening to the gentle hush of the water. For long minutes there was only the natural symphony of the night, until suddenly the recorder picked up a series of soft, rhythmic sounds that I could not attribute to any natural cause. There, amid the whispers of the ocean, was a faint, almost imperceptible chant, a series of syllables that resonated with a sorrowful cadence. I felt as though I had stumbled upon a secret conversation between the living and the dead, and my heart pounded with both terror and exhilaration. I returned to the cottage that night with trembling hands and a mind awash with questions. The recordings, when played back in the quiet of my study, were unmistakably not the product of random static. They were deliberate, patterned, as if recited by a chorus of unseen voices. I spent hours listening, transcribing what I could, and comparing the sounds to the chants I had learned from old local texts. Though I couldn't decipher all the words, I felt an undeniable connection to the past, as though the voices were reaching out from the depths of time to share their grief and their wisdom. As the weeks turned into months, I began to sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere around the cottage. The once unsettling whispers began to feel almost like a lullaby, a sorrowful serenade that, while melancholic, also offered a kind of comfort. I found that I was no longer as afraid of the dark or the unknown. Rather, I embraced the mysterious presence as a part of the land's enduring story. I took to recording my daily observations with a fervor, detailing each encounter with a mixture of scientific precision and poetic reverence. The journal became my confidant, a repository for my thoughts, fears, and, eventually, my hopes. I even began to integrate small ritualistic acts into my nightly routine. With Liam's guidance, I fashioned simple charms out of sea glass and driftwood, placing them in strategic locations around the cottage. I would light a small driftwood torch on the porch and recite short chants of remembrance, words borrowed from the old legends and adapted to my own trembling voice. These acts, though simple, seemed to temper the restless energies of the coastal rainforest, if only for a few fleeting hours. There were nights when the whispers grew quieter, and I felt as if the voices were at peace, acknowledging my offerings with a gentle rustle of wind or a distant, soft sigh from the ocean. Of course, not every night was calm. There were moments when the apparitions became so vivid that I would wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering as if trying to escape my chest. On one such night, I awoke to the sound of soft footsteps outside my window, and when I looked out, saw a fleeting figure standing on the misty shoreline. The figure was indistinct, more a shadow than a person, but its presence was undeniable. I couldn't tell if it was a ghost of a long-lost mariner or simply a trick of the light, but the encounter left me shaken. The next morning, I found a new carving on a piece of driftwood near my door, a series of intertwined lines that resembled a symbol I had seen in one of Liam's old books about coastal legends. It was as if the very essence of the sea had left its mark on my sanctuary. Despite these unnerving experiences, I felt an unyielding pull to remain in this place. I had come here to escape, to heal, and, in many ways, I was. The coastal rainforest, with its persistent rain, Its haunting beauty and its mysterious murmurs had become more than just a backdrop to my writing. It was a living, breathing companion in my journey of self-discovery. Every day, as I sat at my desk with the sound of the ocean and the rustling of ancient trees in the background, I felt that I was part of something much larger than myself, a continuum of memory, loss, and, ultimately, hope. Liam's visits became more frequent as he sensed that I was delving deeper into the mysteries of the land. Over cups of strong, dark coffee on my creaking porch, he shared more tales of ghostly mariners and the tragic fates of ships lost at sea. He spoke of a particular legend, a ship that had vanished in a sudden violent storm decades ago, its crew lost to the depths, but whose voices still echoed along the coast on stormy nights. His words, delivered with the weight of personal conviction, made the spectral encounters seem less like isolated events and more like part of a vast, interwoven tapestry of history and spirit. I began to correspond with local historians and even a few maritime researchers who had studied the wrecks and mysteries of the Pacific Northwest. Their accounts, filled with grim details of storms and loss, lent an air of veracity to the phenomena I had been experiencing. I compiled these stories alongside my own observations, slowly building a narrative that straddled the line between folklore and personal memoir. It was a delicate balance, a blend of careful documentation and raw emotion, that allowed me to process the inexplicable and, in doing so, perhaps forge a deeper connection with the land and its spectral inhabitants. There were, of course, moments when the isolation and the constant intrusion of the supernatural threatened to overwhelm me. I would sometimes feel as though the very air was charged with sorrow, a tangible, oppressive melancholy that seeped into my bones and left me feeling hollow. In those times, I would retreat into my writing, pouring every shred of fear, wonder, and longing onto the page. I wrote of storm-tossed seas and haunted shorelines, of voices that whispered secrets from beyond the veil of time. My words, raw and unfiltered, became both a catharsis and a means of communication, a way to reach out to the unseen and to bridge the gap between the living and the lost. As the seasons changed, the constant rain began to ease into a steady, almost rhythmic drizzle that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the land. The once turbulent skies gave way to moments of breathtaking clarity, a sunrise over the ocean that painted the clouds in hues of rose and gold, a sunset that set the cliffs ablaze with fire. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the beauty that coexisted with the sorrow. I came to understand that the coastal rainforest was a repository of both grief and hope, a place where the voices of the past mingled with the present, urging those who listened to remember and to heal. Today, as I sit by the window of my little cottage, the steady drizzle continues outside, blurring the world into a watercolor of greens and grays. The murmurs of the ocean and the distant calls of unseen sailors are a constant backdrop, a reminder of lives lost, stories untold, and mysteries that defy easy explanation. I have chosen to remain here, to document and to understand the enigmatic presence that has woven itself into the fabric of my existence. I know that the supernatural encounters may never cease entirely, that there will always be nights when the whispers grow louder and the shadows more distinct. Yet, I have come to accept them as an integral part of this place, a living testament to the enduring power of memory and the inexorable pull of the past. In the quiet moments before dawn, as the mist slowly lifts and the first light of day reveals the rugged beauty of the coastline, I find solace in knowing that I am exactly where I am meant to be. The coastal rainforest, with all its mysteries and murmurs, has embraced me as one of its own, a keeper of its secrets, a chronicler of its timeless sorrow and unfathomable hope. And so, I continue my work here, pen in hand and heart wide open, determined to honor the voices of the lost and to forge a future where the echoes of the past guide us gently into a new dawn. I never imagined that the humid, moss-draped wetlands of the Florida Panhandle could be both a sanctuary and a source of spine-chilling mystery. My name is Riley Thompson, and as a botanist with an unyielding fascination for rare wetland plants, I'd long dreamed of immersing myself in an environment where nature reigned supreme. After years of stifling academic research and the clamor of city life, I finally decided to leave it all behind. I acquired a modest, off-grid house on the edge of the bayou, near Apalachicola, a place where the air was thick with moisture, and the slow, languid rhythm of life echoed the ancient pulse of the swamp. The journey to my new home was a gradual awakening. I drove along winding country roads flanked by towering cypress trees, whose hanging moss swayed in the gentle breeze. The humidity pressed against my skin like a soft, constant embrace, and every breath was filled with the rich, earthy scent of decaying leaves and fresh water. I remember the first time I saw the bayou stretch out before me, a vast, shimmering expanse of murky water dotted with lily pads and punctuated by patches of reed. It was both beautiful and foreboding, a living tapestry that promised secrets hidden beneath its placid surface. When I arrived at the homestead, the house itself greeted me like an old friend. It was a weathered structure, built from reclaimed wood and corrugated metal, with a wraparound veranda that overlooked a narrow waterway snaking its way through the marsh. The structure needed work, but there was a charm about it that no modern building could replicate. I spent my first days repairing broken boards on the porch, patching leaks in the roof, and setting up a small greenhouse where I planned to cultivate the wetland species that had long captivated my research. Even as I labored in the relentless humidity, I felt a deep sense of calm. The bayou seemed to welcome me, whispering promises of new beginnings. Yet, even as I settled in and began my daily routines, rising with the slow light of dawn, checking the moisture levels of my plants, and wandering along narrow, muddy trails to collect specimens, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not entirely alone. There were subtle signs, almost imperceptible at first, that something in the swamp was watching, listening. One evening, as I was tending to a patch of rare orchids in the greenhouse, I noticed that the usual chorus of insect hums and bird calls was momentarily replaced by an eerie silence. The stillness was broken by the soft lapping of water against the house's foundation, a sound that, under the usual circumstances, would have been comforting. But that night, when I stepped out onto the veranda after a sudden downpour, I discovered a series of wet footprints trailing across the wooden planks. They were small, almost childlike, and led off into the darkness along the edge of the bayou. I couldn't recall having seen anyone, and yet the prints were fresh, glistening with raindrops in the pale light of a waning moon. I tried to dismiss the footprints as the work of an animal, a raccoon, perhaps, or even a stray cat, but a growing sense of unease nagged at me. I had always been practical and methodical, devoted to the study of living things in their natural state. The bayou was known for its unpredictable wildlife, and I was well aware of the myriad creatures that roamed its wetlands. Still, the footprints had an uncanny, deliberate quality that set them apart from the random tracks left by the local fauna. I began to suspect that there might be more to these nocturnal wanderings than mere animal activity. It wasn't long before I encountered someone who might help me unravel these mysteries. Her name is Mara, a native guide with deep roots in the bayou and an intimate knowledge of its lore. I met Mara on a humid afternoon when I was out collecting samples along a narrow, winding waterway. Her presence was as natural as the cypress trees themselves. She moved through the marsh with a quiet grace, as if the swamp were an extension of her own being. With eyes that seemed to reflect both kindness and caution, she listened intently as I explained the strange occurrences at my homestead, the unsettling footprints, the inexplicable moments of silence, and the soft, distant sounds that sometimes resembled mournful singing carried on the wind. Mara's expression darkened as she began to speak in a hushed tone. "There are stories in these parts," she said, her voice low and measured, "stories of lost souls and vengeful spirits, of people who met tragic ends in the swamp and whose energy still lingers among the reeds and the water." She told me about old legends passed down by generations of locals, tales of fishermen and travelers who vanished without a trace during sudden storms or under mysterious circumstances. According to Mara, some believed that the bayou was haunted by the restless spirits of those who had perished in its depths, their sorrow and anger manifesting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. "The swamp holds memories," she explained, "and sometimes it reveals them in forms we do not understand." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of truth that I could not dismiss. Intrigued and increasingly unsettled, I began to keep a detailed journal of every anomaly I experienced. Each entry meticulously documented the weather, the state of my plants, and any unusual sounds or sights. I installed a few motion-sensitive cameras around the perimeter of my homestead, focusing especially on the veranda and the narrow paths that led into the marsh. At first, the cameras captured only the expected: the gentle swaying of trees, the occasional flutter of a bat's wings, even a stray cat stalking silently through the underbrush. But then, on a cool, humid night after a particularly heavy rain, one of the cameras recorded something that sent a chill down my spine. I reviewed the footage in my small, dimly lit study. The timestamp indicated that it had been taken at around 2 a.m., when the world outside was cloaked in darkness. The screen flickered to life, showing a section of the veranda bathed in the soft glow of a nearby lantern. Suddenly, there was movement. A figure, small and indistinct, crossing the porch in a slow, deliberate manner. The figure's steps were measured and silent, leaving behind a trail of wet footprints that glistened like tiny jewels against the worn wood. For a few agonizing seconds, the camera captured the figure moving past the open door, disappearing into the thick darkness of the bayou. I watched the footage repeatedly, each time hoping for more clarity, yet the figure remained a blurred, ghostly silhouette, its features impossible to discern. That same night, as I lay awake in bed with the persistent drone of crickets and the occasional distant call of an owl, I thought I heard a soft, mournful melody, a haunting song that seemed to drift on the humid air. It was not the typical call of any swamp bird or animal I was familiar with. It was something more human, imbued with a sorrow that resonated deep within me. The melody rose and fell, fading in and out until it was swallowed by the night. I shivered beneath the thin blanket, feeling as though the very air around me was alive with memories and secrets. In the following weeks, Mara became a constant presence in my investigations. She would visit on cool afternoons, arriving in a weathered pickup truck that was as much a part of the swamp as the cypress knees and the trailing Spanish moss. Together, we would walk along narrow boardwalks that stretched over stagnant water and wade through shallow channels where the water was so clear that the bottom was visible, revealing patterns of silt and decomposing vegetation. Mara shared with me more of the local lore, stories of families who had been cursed by the swamp, of desperate souls who wandered off into the marsh and were never seen again, and of lights that sometimes danced on the water like will-o'-the-wisps, leading unwary travelers astray. Her words made the inexplicable events at my homestead take on a different dimension. No longer were the footprints and the spectral movements simply odd occurrences. They became part of a larger narrative, one steeped in tragedy and loss. Mara mentioned that many of the locals believed that the bayou was a resting place for those who had died in the water, people who, in life, had been drawn to its beauty and bounty, only to be claimed by its hidden depths. Their spirits, unable to find peace, were said to wander the edges of the swamp, their presence signaled by unexplained phenomena such as mine. I listened intently, my rational mind struggling to reconcile the scientific details of wetland ecology with the ancient, almost mythic stories that Mara recounted. One humid night, after a sudden summer rain had left the air heavy and the ground slick with water, I decided to venture out onto the veranda with my journal and a small flashlight. The sky was overcast, and a fine mist clung to everything, blurring the edges of the world. I sat in silence, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the steady drip of water from the eaves. At first, the sounds were familiar, a comforting background hum that had become my new normal. But gradually, the ambient noises seemed to coalesce into something else, a faint, sorrowful singing that I couldn't quite place. It was as though 1,000 voices, soft and indistinct, were coming together in a melancholy chorus. I strained to hear the words, but they were drowned out by the ambient sounds of the swamp. That same night, I found wet footprints again, this time leading from the edge of the veranda to a narrow shadowed path that wound into the thick undergrowth. The footprints were fresh, the imprints deep and deliberate, and they seemed to suggest that someone, or something, had walked right past my door. I followed the trail for a short distance before it vanished into a tangle of reeds and overgrown vines. I couldn't help but feel that I was being drawn into the swamp itself, that the land was beckoning me to uncover its secrets, no matter how unsettling they might be. I began to wonder if perhaps I was not the only one drawn to this mysterious presence. I started receiving occasional anonymous letters slipped under my door, short, cryptic messages written in a careful hand. The notes were sparse in words, but each carried a sense of urgency and sorrow. One note read simply, "Remember the lost. They call to you." Another said, "Do not walk alone at midnight by the water's edge." I never discovered who sent them, and though I felt a growing dread, I also sensed that they were connected to the very phenomena I had been documenting. As the summer deepened and the nights grew longer, my research took on a dual purpose. Not only was I studying the botanical wonders of the bayou, but I was also, almost unwittingly, chronicling its spectral history. I began to photograph every anomaly, the subtle movements in the mist, the fleeting figures in the dark, the ephemeral lights that danced just above the water. I spent hours poring over the images on my computer, searching for patterns or details that might offer an explanation. Yet, the more I looked, the more I was convinced that the swamp was not merely a backdrop for natural phenomena, but an active participant in a tragic, ongoing story of loss and longing. Mara and I eventually decided to perform a small cleansing ritual, a joint effort to honor the restless spirits of the bayou and, perhaps, to set them free. On an overcast evening, we gathered a bundle of dried Spanish moss, a small vial of locally distilled herbal elixir, and a few offerings of wildflowers that grew along the water's edge. Together, we walked to a small clearing near the water, where the bayou's current slowed and the air felt charged with anticipation. Mara explained that, according to local tradition, it was important to acknowledge and appease the spirits rather than to fight them. We arranged the wildflowers in a small circle and sprinkled a few drops of the herbal elixir around them, all the while chanting a short prayer passed down from the elders of her community. The ritual was simple, almost intimate, and as we finished, I felt a brief but profound stillness, a moment when the bayou seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. In the weeks that followed, the phenomena did not cease entirely, but there was a noticeable shift. The wet footprints became less frequent, and the disembodied singing receded to a gentle murmur that could almost be mistaken for the natural symphony of the swamp. I continued my daily routines with a cautious optimism, balancing my research on wetland flora with a growing acceptance of the bayou's spectral presence. Every evening, as I sat on the veranda watching the twilight meld into the darkness, I felt that I was not intruding on the swamp, but rather becoming part of its long, sorrowful narrative, a guardian of its hidden memories, and an unwitting chronicler of its eternal melancholy. Despite the lingering mystery, I resolved to remain at my homestead. The bayou, with all its beauty and its burdens, had become a part of me. I began to see my off-grid life not as an escape from the modern world, but as an immersion into a realm where nature and spirit coexisted in an intricate, often heartbreaking dance. I documented my findings in my journal, not as a scientific record alone, but as a testament to the layered, poignant stories that the swamp whispered in the quiet hours before dawn. Each entry was a blend of botanical observations and soulful reflections, a reminder that in this humid, living landscape, every leaf and ripple carried the weight of history. Every gust of wind echoed with voices from a time long past. There are nights when I still wake suddenly, heart pounding, convinced I have seen a spectral figure at the edge of the light, a ghostly silhouette gliding along the water's surface before vanishing into the mist. I no longer feel terror in those moments, only a deep, aching sorrow, as if I were witnessing the endless mourning of a lost world. I have come to understand that the bayou holds its grief close, yet it also offers a strange kind of solace, a connection to something timeless and enduring, the very elements that make life here challenging, the high humidity that clings to your skin, the seasonal floods that reshape the landscape, the ceaseless murmur of the water, are the same elements that forge a bond between the living and the dead. Now, as I sit at my weathered desk in the soft glow of a lamp powered by a modest solar array, I can still hear the distant echo of that mournful song carried on the wind. I read over my journal entries and review my photographs, each one a piece of a puzzle that may never be fully solved. My off-grid life in the bayou is not without its hardships, but it is a life steeped in meaning, a daily reminder that beauty and sorrow often go hand in hand. The voices of the lost, the wet footprints left behind, and the spectral lights dancing over the water are all part of this living mosaic, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the relentless pull of nature. I have come to accept that I will never fully understand the mysteries of the swamp. Instead, I choose to honor them, to record them in my writing, and to integrate them into the tapestry of my life. With each day, I learn a little more about the fragile balance between science and myth, between the tangible world of flora and fauna, and the intangible realm of spirit and memory. Mara remains my trusted guide, her presence a constant source of reassurance as we navigate the twilight between what is known and what can only be felt. Together, we share quiet moments on the veranda, discussing the subtle changes in the bayou, the shifting patterns of water and light, and the ancient stories that seem to emerge from the depths of the swamp. I know that there will always be nights when the bayou speaks in hushed, sorrowful tones, when its mysteries rise up to greet me in dreams and in the silent spaces between heartbeats. And though I sometimes feel the weight of those voices, I also feel an enduring hope, a belief that in acknowledging the past, in giving voice to the lost, I am helping to weave a future that respects the delicate interplay of life and memory. In this humid, haunted corner of the world, I have found not only refuge, but also a calling. I am both a researcher and a witness, a caretaker of stories that are as old as the cypress trees, and as deep as the bayou itself. So I remain here, committed to the quiet study of the swamp's botanical wonders and the enigmatic echoes of its past. Each day is a step deeper into the mystery, a journey that fills me with a bittersweet blend of wonder and melancholy. The bayou has become my home, my muse, and my silent companion, a place where the present is inextricably intertwined with the echoes of those who once walked these watery paths. And as I continue to document and honor the secrets of this ancient land, I do so with the firm belief that sometimes the most profound understanding comes not from unraveling every mystery, but from embracing the haunting beauty of the unknown. Since I was a child growing up near the water, I've always felt an inexplicable pull toward the ebb and flow of the tides. That connection deepened over the years until I found myself at a crossroads in life, a time when the familiar rhythms of a hectic academic career in marine biology no longer soothed my troubled spirit. After enduring heartbreak and the gradual disintegration of the world I once knew, I made the life-altering decision to leave behind sterile laboratories and crowded lecture halls for a place where the pulse of nature might offer a fresh start. This quest for renewal led me to a weathered boathouse on the banks of Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, a modest sanctuary where the gentle lapping of water against aged wood and the slow dance of tide and fog promised both solace and mystery. The journey to this new beginning was a slow immersion into a world shaped by time and tide. I traveled down winding roads that skirted dense groves of salt-tolerant trees and passed through small coastal towns where the air still smelled of brine and bygone eras. Arriving at the boathouse felt like stepping into a living museum. The structure, its exterior a faded mix of blue and white, bore the marks of decades of salt, sun, and sorrow. Weathered wooden docks creaked underfoot, and every plank seemed to whisper stories of countless fishermen and lost ships. In that moment, as I stepped onto the creaking dock and felt the damp wood beneath my feet, I understood that I had entered a realm where history was not confined to books. It was alive in the very fabric of the bay. The first few weeks were devoted to both practical work and quiet reflection. I set about repairing the rotted boards of the boathouse, scrubbing off layers of accumulated salt and mildew, and arranging a small workspace in a corner that overlooked the water. My days were punctuated by long walks along the shoreline, notebook in hand, where I recorded the slow rhythm of the tides, sketched the interplay of fog and light, and observed the timeless patterns of nature. I found comfort in the simplicity of each day, rising with the soft light of dawn, tending to modest repairs, and watching the gradual transformation of the sky from a hazy prelude to a dazzling display of stars at night. Yet, beneath the serene surface of daily routines, there was an undercurrent of mystery that gradually seeped into my consciousness. One foggy evening, as dusk softened the edges of the world, I sat on the weathered dock, listening to the quiet murmur of the bay. The sounds of gently lapping water and distant gull cries blended with something more elusive, a series of soft, echoing calls that seemed to rise from the depths of the mist. I couldn't quite place the sound at first. It was as if the bay itself were speaking in a language of sighs and whispers. Although I had long been trained to trust scientific observation, that night a deep, almost visceral feeling told me that there were layers of meaning hidden in those murmurs, messages from lives once lived, secrets of tragedies long past. In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle signs that I was not entirely alone. While exploring the boathouse one afternoon, I discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose board that contained several antique pages from a journal. The pages were yellowed with age and filled with elegant, if fading script that chronicled the life of someone who had once called this bay home. They spoke of tempests and shipwrecks, of desperate nights and ghostly apparitions seen drifting along the docks. I felt an almost magnetic pull to decipher every word, to learn the story of the souls who had etched their memories into the very timbers of the boathouse. Every fragment I uncovered added another layer to the mystery, a mosaic of sorrow, hope, and the enduring power of the sea. Before long, I encountered Reverend James, a kindly old fisherman whose lifetime on the bay had woven him into its legend. I met him one cool, mist-laden morning while I was busy securing a loose board on the dock. Appearing as if from the fog itself, he leaned on a worn wooden cane and greeted me with a warm, measured smile. "You must be Elena," he said in a gravelly tone that carried both authority and gentle familiarity. Over a pot of strong black coffee brewed on a portable stove, we talked for hours. He recounted the storied past of the Chesapeake Bay, weaving tales of doomed vessels and spectral figures that haunted the shoreline. His words transformed the bay from a simple expanse of water into a living chronicle of human struggle and supernatural sorrow. Reverend James explained that on certain nights, when the mist thickened and the tide pulled back just so, the voices of the lost rose from the depths to call out in mournful chorus. Each tale he told was imbued with a reverence for the lives that had been claimed by the sea, and his eyes, dark and knowing, seemed to bear witness to those very memories. Encouraged by Reverend James's insights, I immersed myself in local history. Afternoons were spent at the modest public library in the nearby town, poring over old newspapers, ship logs, and archived letters. I learned of a particularly violent storm that had battered the coast decades ago, a tempest so fierce it had sunk several vessels and left a legacy of grief among the coastal communities. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the bay was a repository of both human endeavor and human tragedy. The spectral figures I sometimes glimpsed in the fog, the soft calls that echoed in the quiet hours before dawn, and even the antique journal fragments I had found were all interwoven into a tapestry of loss and remembrance. Nights soon began to take on a ritualistic quality. After a day of mending the old boathouse and collecting my scattered thoughts, I would settle onto the dock beneath a sky laden with stars. The gentle cadence of the tide and the rustling of wind through the trees provided a natural symphony, while my thoughts swirled with both scientific curiosity and a newfound spiritual yearning. I would light small candles on the dock, their flames trembling in the coastal breeze, and simply sit in silence. In those moments, I felt an almost tangible connection to the souls that had once graced these waters, voices that whispered through the night and memories that shimmered in the fog. It was as though the bay were offering me its own quiet benediction, a reminder that even in sorrow there could be healing. One particularly clear evening, when the moon hung low and silver over the water, I resolved to deepen my engagement with the mysteries of the place. With a small audio recorder in hand, I ventured out along a narrow, winding path that led from the boathouse to a secluded cove reputed among locals to be a threshold between the living and the lost. The cove was a small, hidden inlet, where the water was remarkably calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the pale light of the moon and the encroaching fog. I set the recorder on a flat rock and sat silently, letting the sounds of the night wash over me. For long, tense minutes there was nothing but the natural rhythm of the bay, until gradually a series of soft, rhythmic chants began to filter into the recorder. The words were indistinct and in a language I could not immediately recognize, but they carried an undeniable cadence of sorrow. It felt as if an unseen choir were chanting a litany of remembrance, their voices rising and falling in harmony with the lapping waves. I listened in silent awe, feeling that moment as a profound communion with the past. I returned to the boathouse that night with a head full of questions, and a heart both heavy and hopeful. In the following weeks, I devoted myself to a meticulous record of these experiences. Every night, I would review the recordings, transcribe fragments of the chants, and compare them with the old texts I had discovered in the hidden compartment. I photographed the subtle details of the bay, the way the fog blurred the outline of the shoreline, the intricate patterns formed by the interplay of moonlight and water, and the fleeting silhouettes that sometimes materialized in the periphery of my vision. Each image, each note in my journal, was a small piece of a puzzle that spanned decades, if not centuries. In time, I began to notice personal changes as well. My once restless heart, battered by loss and isolation, started to find a quiet rhythm in tune with the bay's gentle pulses. The spectral encounters that had initially filled me with dread now stirred within me a deep, reflective melancholy, a sense that the memories of the past were not there to haunt me, but to guide me. I came to see the Chesapeake Bay not merely as a body of water, but as a living archive of human experience, a repository of every whispered farewell, every tear shed for those lost at sea. Even as I struggled to reconcile my scientific background with the profound, almost mystical experiences I was living through, I discovered that truth sometimes resides in the spaces between logic and legend. Reverend James continued to be a pillar of wisdom in my new life. His visits became a regular fixture, and our conversations often stretched late into the night. We would sit together on the dock, watching as the tide receded slowly into the vast expanse, and he would share recollections of storms past and the souls that had been claimed by the bay. Every ripple, he told me one night as a gentle breeze stirred the surface, carries a memory, and every gust of wind is a voice from the deep. His words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply with me and lent a kind of sacred legitimacy to my own experiences. As the seasons subtly shifted, and the relentless summer heat yielded to the cooler, more temperate air of early fall, I began to integrate the bay's mysteries into my daily life. I organized small gatherings on the dock, inviting a few local friends and fellow seekers to share their own stories of loss and remembrance. We lit candles together, each flame a small beacon against the encroaching darkness, and quietly recited prayers or shared memories of those we had lost. In those moments, the boathouse transformed from a solitary refuge into a living space of communal healing, a place where the boundaries between past and present blurred, and the voices of the lost were honored with gentle reverence. I also expanded my correspondence with local historians and maritime researchers, sharing my photographs and journal entries in the hope of piecing together the fragmented narrative of the bay. Their responses, often tinged with both scholarly caution and heartfelt passion, validated many of my own observations and encouraged me to continue my quest. I learned of shipwrecks that had never been fully explained, of fishermen whose names had faded from memory, but whose tragic ends still echoed along the water's edge. Each new piece of information added weight to the notion that the bay was much more than a scenic backdrop. It was a living testament to the interplay of human endeavor, loss, and the inexorable passage of time. In the quiet solitude of the boathouse, with the soft hum of the bay and the rustle of ancient tales in the wind, I found that my grief began to transform. The heartache that had once felt unbearable slowly gave way to a tender, reflective melancholy, a state of being in which sorrow was both acknowledged and gently transmuted into hope. I continued to write, capturing every nuance of the bay's presence in my journal, each entry a careful blend of scientific observation and soulful reflection. I recorded the soft chorus of the spectral voices, the faint brush of unseen footsteps on the weathered planks, and the almost imperceptible shifts in the patterns of fog and light. Every detail was a small reminder that the Chesapeake was not just a place of loss, but also a repository of resilience, a place where the beauty of memory could offer a guiding light through even the darkest nights. Now, as I sit at my desk in the soft glow of a lamp powered by a modest solar array, I can still hear the bay's quiet murmur mingling with the gentle rustle of the tide. My journal lies open before me, its pages filled with careful observations, sketches of the shoreline, and fragments of the old chants I have come to treasure. Each entry is a testament to the enduring power of the past, a reminder that every echo, every ripple in the fog, holds within it a story of love, loss, and the quiet persistence of hope. I have chosen to remain in this restored boathouse not as an escape from the chaos of the modern world, but as a deliberate act of remembrance and reconciliation. The Chesapeake Bay, with its storied history and spectral presence, has become both my muse and my sanctuary, in the interplay of light and shadow on the water, in the whispered voices that seem to rise from the depths. I have found a connection to a legacy that transcends time, a legacy that reminds me that even the most sorrowful memories can give birth to new understanding, and, ultimately, to healing. There are nights when the bay speaks more clearly, when the soft, echoing calls of those lost at sea merge with the sound of the water and the rustle of ancient trees, creating a symphony that is as haunting as it is beautiful. In those moments, I feel the presence of every soul that has ever graced these waters, and I find solace in the thought that their stories live on in the gentle cadence of the tide. I have learned that to listen is to honor, and to record is to ensure that no voice is ever truly silenced. Every sunrise brings a renewed sense of wonder. As I rise with the soft light filtering through the gauzy morning mist, I am reminded of the transient beauty of life, the impermanence of every moment, and the quiet dignity of the past. I take my place on the dock, gaze out over the shimmering water, and let the rhythmic lapping of the bay fill me with a profound sense of gratitude. I am Elena Carter, a woman who has turned her grief into a dialogue with the past, who has embraced the mysteries of the Chesapeake, and who now believes that in every loss there is the potential for a quiet, enduring hope. In the days and nights to come, I will continue to chronicle the subtle interplay between the tangible and the ephemeral, between science and myth. I will capture every fleeting shadow, every soft murmur, every delicate interplay of light on water, as a tribute to the countless souls who have shaped this place. And in doing so, I hope that my work may serve as both a memorial and a guide, a reminder that while the voices of the lost may be faint, they are never truly gone, and that their echoes continue to inspire those who are willing to listen. Here, on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay, amid the timeless dance of tide and fog, I have found not only a refuge for my wounded spirit, but also a calling, a commitment to preserve the memories of a past that continues to shape our present. I remain steadfast in my pursuit of understanding, determined to honor every whisper and every ripple as a testament to the enduring power of memory. In this place, where the water meets the sky and history lingers like a gentle perpetual refrain, I have discovered that even the deepest sorrows can eventually give way to the quiet beauty of hope. I grew up hearing the slow, measured cadence of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a lullaby of rustling leaves, creaking wood, and distant bird calls. But it wasn't until I left behind the relentless pace of city life that I truly came to understand their language. My name is Sam Jenkins, and I arrived at my off-grid farmhouse in North Carolina's Blue Ridge with little more than a canvas bag of belongings, a head full of ideas, and a deep need to find peace after years of constant noise and endless deadlines. I had spent most of my adult life chasing fleeting moments of creative inspiration in cramped studios and busy offices. But the modern world had begun to wear me thin. I needed a place to slow down, to listen to my own thoughts, and to see if the quiet, green hills might help me rediscover who I once was. I remember the long drive up the mountain, a ribbon of winding roads flanked by dense stands of hardwood and evergreens that seemed to stretch on forever. The radio played softly, but soon the sounds of the city were replaced by the hum of nature. In those moments, as the landscape unfolded slowly, I felt an unexpected surge of relief. When I finally pulled up to the farmhouse, a weathered two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, I was both awed and intimidated by its isolation. The property, nestled on a gentle slope and surrounded by a tangle of mature oaks and pines, had a stubborn beauty about it. Every board and every stone spoke of years gone by, of lives lived long before my own. The first few days were a blur of practical work. I spent mornings repairing the sagging roof and broken fence boards, afternoons sorting through the remnants left behind by previous owners, and evenings sketching ideas in a battered notebook by the light of a single kerosene lamp. I wasn't a carpenter by trade, and every creak or leak in the old farmhouse reminded me that this place was as much a challenge as it was a refuge. I had anticipated a struggle, but I hadn't expected the isolation to be as profound as it turned out to be. In the stillness of my new home, the passage of time was measured not in clock hours, but in the soft shifting of light over the land. At dawn, I'd wake to the gentle glow of a new day. By dusk, the fading light would cast long, uncertain shadows on the mountain slopes. It was during one of those early evenings that I first noticed something odd. I had just finished a day's work, scraping off old paint from the front door and mending a broken step, and I settled on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The sun was dipping low, and the sky was a soft wash of pastel hues. I remember looking out over the rolling hills and hearing, faintly at first, a kind of humming sound. At first, I assumed it was merely the wind moving through the trees, but as the light dimmed further, the sound took on a musical quality, almost like a gentle, breathy whisper layered over the rustling leaves. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, a trick of the long shadows, or something else entirely. I sat there for a long while, listening, trying to capture the moment with my pen and paper, but the sound seemed to vanish as quickly as it had come. Over the next several days, I began noticing small, inexplicable details around the property that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while I was clearing the overgrown garden behind the house, I stumbled upon a small object half buried in the dirt near an old, twisted oak. It was a locket, tarnished by time and dirt, with delicate filigree along its edge. I carefully brushed off the grime and opened it to find a faded photograph of a young woman in period dress. The eyes in the photo seemed to follow me, and for a moment I felt an inexplicable chill. I wondered if it had been left behind as some sort of message, or if it was simply a forgotten relic of a previous life on this land. I tucked it away in my pocket and resolved to look into the history of the farmhouse later. Another evening, as twilight settled and the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, I was walking back from checking the solar panels when I noticed something glinting among the fallen leaves near the side of the house. I bent down and picked up an old, faded photograph, this one featuring a family posed in front of the very same farmhouse. The edges were curled, and the image had a softness that made it seem as if it were a memory rather than a photograph. In the background, I could just make out a figure standing near the doorway, though it was impossible to tell if it was part of the family or something else entirely. I felt an odd tug in my chest as I studied the picture, a mixture of nostalgia and a subtle, lingering sadness. I didn't immediately share these discoveries with anyone. The farmhouse had an air of solemn secrecy, and I felt that the land was speaking in quiet, intimate ways that I wasn't yet ready to interrupt with rational inquiry. But soon enough, I realized I needed guidance. That's when I met Diane, a local herbalist, storyteller, and the kind of person who had grown up with the mountains in her blood. Diane's small shop was a converted barn on the outskirts of town, filled with dried herbs, old books, and the warm, inviting scent of incense and earth. I first met her on a brisk autumn morning when I ventured into town to buy supplies. I asked her about the history of the area, about any old legends or tales that might explain the odd occurrences I'd been experiencing. Diane's eyes lit up as she recounted the lore of the Blue Ridge. Many years ago, she said in a gentle, measured voice, people believed that the mountains held both the memories of those who once lived here and the power of the earth itself. Some say that the land is alive with the spirits of ancestors, both benevolent and sorrowful. You might find that old relics, like a locket or a faded photograph, are not mere coincidences. They're signs, gentle reminders of the lives that shaped this place. Diane spoke of apparitions that sometimes appeared at twilight, of whispered voices carried on the mountain winds, and of rituals once performed by generations of locals to honor the spirits of the land. Her tone was neither fearful nor superstitious. It was reverent, as if she truly believed that every stone and every tree held a fragment of someone's soul. Inspired by her words, I began to look at my experiences in a new light. The locket and the old photograph were not simply odd finds. They were fragments of a story that had unfolded on this land long before I arrived. I started keeping a more detailed journal, not only recording the physical changes around the farmhouse, like the occasional power fluctuation of my solar panels and the creaks of settling wood, but also describing the emotional landscape that accompanied them. In my journal, I wrote about the way the mountains seemed to breathe, about the delicate interplay of shadow and light on the rolling hills, and about the soft, mysterious hum that sometimes filled the twilight air. My days became a steady rhythm of practical work and reflective exploration. I repaired the farmhouse bit by bit, patching up the old windows, sanding down creaky floors, and slowly coaxing modern conveniences into a structure that had once been built with a different time in mind. I spent long afternoons in the garden, carefully tending to a mix of native wildflowers and the few vegetables I hoped would thrive in the fertile soil. And every evening, as the sun sank behind the distant ridges, I would take my notebook out onto the porch and simply sit, listening, observing, and writing down every detail. Sometimes, as dusk turned to night, I would catch sight of a figure in the periphery of my vision, a shape that seemed to drift among the trees, too quiet and fleeting to be anything but a trick of the light, yet persistent enough to set my heart racing. Other times, I would find a small, unidentifiable object near the steps of the farmhouse, as if someone had left it behind purposely, a quiet invitation to remember or to reflect. As autumn deepened, the Blue Ridge transformed into a riot of color. The trees blazed with reds, oranges, and yellows, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. It was during this season of transition that the supernatural elements of my new life became more pronounced. One chilly evening, shortly after sunset, I was walking along a narrow, winding path behind the farmhouse when I heard a soft, humming sound that was distinct from the rustle of the wind. It was a low, almost imperceptible melody that seemed to come from deep within the forest. I stopped in my tracks and listened, heart pounding as the sound drifted through the trees. There was no explanation for it in the natural world. The local birds had long since ceased their songs at this hour, and the wind itself carried only the usual sighs of the evening. I stood there for several long minutes, trying to capture the melody in my mind until it gradually faded into the silence of the night. The next morning, I mentioned the humming to Diane over a cup of herbal tea at her shop. She listened intently, nodding slowly as if she had heard the same sound in her own dreams. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the land sings in ways we can't always understand. It's as if the mountains themselves are trying to communicate, to share their memories with those who are willing to listen." Her words resonated with me, and I began to record these experiences with a careful blend of scientific observation and personal reflection. I wasn't simply noting odd sounds. I was documenting a conversation with the land itself, a dialogue that spanned generations of human presence and ancient natural forces. In the following weeks, I found that the strange occurrences began to weave themselves into the fabric of my daily life. I began to notice that on certain evenings, when the light was low and the air was cool, I would catch a glimpse of something moving among the trees, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of shape that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on it. On another occasion, while I was working in the garden, I discovered an old, faded photograph partially buried in the soil near a rock outcrop. This time, the image was of a man in a weathered hat, standing stoically in front of a farmhouse not unlike mine. The photograph was unsigned and undated, but it carried an air of quiet dignity and sorrow, as if the man had been a caretaker of the land, perhaps even a kindred spirit. I kept it carefully in my journal, a silent reminder of the lives that had come before me. The most unsettling incident occurred on a late October evening. I had finished dinner and was sitting on the porch, watching as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, casting long shadows that merged with the deepening dusk. The sky was a canvas of shifting purples and blues, and the cool night air was filled with the gentle sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves. As I sipped a cup of lukewarm tea, I became aware of a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, a series of words perhaps, or merely the sound of the wind passing through a narrow gap in the trees. I strained my ears, but the sound was too faint to discern any clear meaning. Then, as I set my cup down, I noticed something near the base of the old oak tree at the edge of the porch, a small, delicate object, glimmering briefly in the fading light. It was a faded photograph, similar to the ones I had found earlier, but this one was of a young woman with an expression of quiet sadness. The photograph lay there, as if deliberately placed, and I felt a shiver run through me. Had someone been here? Was this another message from the past, or something else entirely? I brought the photograph inside and examined it by the soft glow of an oil lamp. Its edges were frayed, and the image was almost ghost-like, a memory caught in time. I wrote in my journal about the experience, describing every detail with a mix of wonder and apprehension. I had grown accustomed to the idea that the Blue Ridge was more than just a physical space. It was a repository of memories, of lives interwoven with the land in ways that defied simple explanation. As winter approached, the changes in the landscape were subtle yet profound. The vibrant hues of autumn gave way to the muted greens and grays of early winter. The temperature remained relatively mild compared to the harsh, frozen landscapes I had once dreaded, but there was a quiet chill that seemed to seep into the old farmhouse and linger in the quiet spaces between day and night. My daily routine continued, albeit with a heightened awareness of the ever-present mysteries. I repaired more of the aging structure, tended to the remaining garden patches, and spent long hours writing in my journal, capturing not only the physical details of the land, but also the delicate interplay of memory, myth, and the raw emotion that now filled my days. Diane and I would meet regularly during this period, often on long walks through the nearby woodlands. On one such walk, as we strolled along a narrow trail lined with ferns and moss-covered rocks, Diane paused and pointed to something on the ground, a small, tarnished locket, similar to the one I had found earlier. Sometimes, she explained quietly, the past leaves its tokens behind, little reminders that what was once lost can still be found if you're willing to look. Her words, spoken in a measured tone that conveyed both wisdom and empathy, struck a deep chord in me. I picked up the locket and opened it, revealing a tiny, faded photograph of a smiling child. It was an image that exuded innocence and hope, a stark contrast to the melancholic images I had found before. I felt that the land was not merely a place of sorrow, but also of hidden joy and enduring life, an intricate tapestry where every thread, no matter how dark, contributed to the overall beauty. There were moments when the weight of it all, of the loss, of the mystery, of the inescapable pull of memory, became almost overwhelming. I would retreat into the quiet of the farmhouse, sitting by the window as I watched the slow dance of shadows and light on the mountain slopes. In those moments, I realized that I had come here not only to escape, but also to confront my own inner demons, to let the land's timeless presence guide me through the labyrinth of grief and ultimately toward healing. The Blue Ridge, with its gentle winds and soft murmur of ancient voices, was teaching me that life was not measured by the absence of sorrow, but by the ability to find beauty even in the midst of it. The turning point in my journey came one crisp evening when I decided to host a small gathering on the porch. I invited a few local friends, people who, like me, had long felt the gentle pull of these mountains, and we sat together beneath a sky strewn with stars. With Diane's help, we lit candles and arranged a modest altar of wildflowers, placing the treasured relics I had found, a faded photograph, a tarnished locket, a few handwritten notes on a wooden tray. We shared stories of loss, of unexpected hope, and of the quiet miracles that the land had bestowed upon us. That night, as the cool breeze carried our whispered words into the darkness, I felt a profound sense of connection to the people, to the past, and to the living spirit of the Blue Ridge. It was as if the mountains themselves had listened and were now offering a gentle, affirming response. In the days that followed, I continued to record every detail in my journal. I wrote about the subtle humming in the twilight, the way the fog would sometimes form patterns on the slopes that resembled faces or figures, and the recurring appearances of small, cherished objects that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. My writing, raw and unadorned, became both an act of documentation and a form of meditation, a way to process the myriad emotions that swirled within me as I lived each day in quiet isolation. I realized that my journey was far from a linear narrative of escape and healing. It was a living, unfolding story, a tapestry of memories, myths, and moments that I would never fully understand, but had come to accept as part of my life. I learned that the Blue Ridge did not promise simple answers or tidy resolutions. Instead, it offered a complex, interwoven legacy of joy and sorrow, of resilience and impermanence that I was compelled to honor through my art and my writing. Now, as I sit in my little farmhouse with the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminating pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches, I find that the Blue Ridge continues to speak to me in its own timeless way. The quiet whispers of the wind, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the occasional glimpse of a figure in the dusk have become part of my daily life, a gentle reminder that I have chosen a path where every day is both a challenge and a gift. I no longer feel the need to flee from the mysterious or the sorrowful. Instead, I welcome them as integral parts of my journey toward understanding and inner peace. I have come to believe that this old farmhouse with its creaking floors and weathered walls is not simply a structure to be fixed and modernized, but a vessel carrying the legacy of all who have lived here before me. In each repaired board and every carefully restored corner, I sense the echo of footsteps, laughter, and even quiet tears that have long since faded into history. I write to preserve these echoes, to honor the stories that have shaped this land, and to remind myself that healing is not a destination but a continuous journey, a conversation between the past and the present, between sorrow and hope. As the seasons turn once again, and I prepare for another quiet night under the vast, unchanging sky of the Blue Ridge, I feel a deep gratitude for the life I have built here. I remain aware of the mysteries that swirl around me, the inexplicable sounds, the ghostly apparitions, the tokens of a long-ago past, but I have learned to live with them, to let them guide my creative spirit rather than overwhelm it. My days are filled with the steady rhythm of work and reflection, each moment a brush stroke on the ever-evolving canvas of my life. I know now that the journey to healing does not come from escaping the unknown, but from embracing it fully. I continue to record my experiences with humility and a quiet determination to see beauty in every shadow. With every story I write, every sketch I complete, and every memory I preserve, I honor the land, the people, and the timeless spirit of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This place has become a part of me, a home not just of brick and wood, but of whispered legends, shared stories, and the enduring hope that even in the midst of sorrow, life offers its own quiet, resilient beauty. I arrived in Central Virginia with little more than a battered suitcase, a stack of notebooks, and a heart full of questions. My name is Marissa Ellis, and after years of working in sterile libraries and lecture halls as a historian, I felt compelled to immerse myself in a place where the past was not locked away in dusty archives, but breathed in every creak of an old house and every whisper of the wind. The moment I stepped onto the worn gravel driveway leading to the restored off-grid cottage in the rolling hills of the Piedmont, I sensed that fate had guided me here. This cottage, its white paint faded by years of sun, and its windows framing the gentle, ever-changing landscape, promised both solitude and a tangible connection to the stories of those who had come before. From the start, life here was a careful balancing act. I spent my mornings tending to practical matters, fixing the rickety porch steps, ensuring the small solar array was charged and steady, and checking the old wood stove that provided a modest, crackling warmth on chilly mornings. The cottage had been lovingly restored by a previous owner who, like me, had a passion for local history. Yet, even after all the repairs, it retained an aura of mystery, a quiet heaviness that seemed to whisper of secrets left behind, of echoes from a bygone era. I soon learned that the everyday rhythms of off-grid living here were interwoven with something inexplicable. I began keeping a meticulous journal from the moment I arrived, not only to record my daily tasks and observations of the countryside, but also to capture the moments that defied logical explanation. On my very first night, as I settled into the creaking bed with only a battery-powered lamp to light the pages of my journal, I heard a gentle, persistent knocking on the cottage walls. It was not the random settling of old wood, but a deliberate, rhythmic tapping that startled me awake. I sat up in the darkness, listening intently as the sound receded into silence as suddenly as it had begun. I could not tell if it were the wind or something else, a voice from the past, perhaps. But that night, I made a careful note. The house, it seemed, was not entirely empty. Days turned to weeks, and I grew more accustomed to the slow pace of life in the Piedmont. I spent long afternoons wandering the fields and woodlands surrounding my cottage, often accompanied by Henry, a retired schoolteacher and amateur folklorist whose gentle curiosity matched my own. Henry had lived in the nearby town his whole life, collecting stories from elders, preserving snippets of local lore like precious fragments of history. Our conversations would wander from the mundane details of weather and crops to the more haunting subjects, tales of a long-ago family feud, of sudden deaths that had left the land with a lingering bitterness, and of ghostly presences that many believed still roamed these hills. I began to understand that the history of this place was not confined to textbooks. It was etched into every stone, every blade of grass, every sigh of the wind. One crisp afternoon, as I was pruning a small rose bush in the overgrown garden behind the cottage, I noticed something glinting among the scattered leaves. I stooped to examine it, and discovered a delicate brass key, its surface intricately engraved with swirling patterns. There was a moment when I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if the key were a token, an invitation, or perhaps a reminder of something lost. I placed it carefully in my journal, along with a note about where and when I found it, and continued my work with a mind that was now alert to the possibility that my new home might be communicating with me in subtle, tangible ways. Later that week, I attended a small gathering at the local community center, a modest affair organized by Henry. A few of us, residents and newcomers alike, had gathered to share our recollections of the area. In hushed voices, the older folks recounted strange happenings, the sound of soft laughter late at night on empty porches, fleeting glimpses of a young woman in a faded dress appearing in the window of a long-abandoned barn, and the persistent aroma of lilacs in rooms that should have smelled of wood smoke and earth. I listened, half in wonder, half in quiet apprehension. There was a sincerity in their words that suggested the odd occurrences in my own cottage were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, spectral narrative woven into the very fabric of this land. Emboldened by the meeting, I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. I began to explore the dusty corners of the cottage more thoroughly, running my fingers along the worn banister and peering behind old doors that had long been neglected. In the attic, I discovered a small trunk filled with yellowed letters, photographs, and a bundle of pressed wildflowers that had once been someone's cherished keepsake. One of the letters, dated over a century ago, spoke of deep sorrow and an unfulfilled promise, a promise that was now as elusive as the whispers I had begun to hear in the night. I spent hours poring over the contents, feeling as though I were piecing together the personal story of someone who had once called this very place home. With each new discovery, the history of the cottage grew richer and more poignant, and I found myself increasingly invested in preserving these remnants of the past. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped low behind the gently rolling hills and cast a warm golden light over the landscape, I decided to host a small impromptu memorial on the cottage porch. I invited a handful of neighbors and friends from town, including Henry, and we gathered around a weathered wooden table set with simple candles, a few fresh wildflowers, and an old radio that played soft, nostalgic tunes from a bygone era. The purpose of the gathering was not immediately clear even to me. It was as if the moment had called for it, a spontaneous desire to honor the echoes of lives that had passed through this place. One by one, we shared our memories and our theories about the strange objects and sounds that we had all experienced, speaking in voices both hushed and earnest. The locket I had found earlier, the brass key, the faded photographs. Each item seemed to take on new meaning as it was discussed. I recalled a story that Henry had told me about a family who had lived in a nearby homestead, whose daughter had vanished mysteriously on a rainy night, leaving behind only a single key and a trail of unanswered questions. Though none of us knew if the story were true, it felt like a piece of a larger, living mosaic, a tapestry of love, loss, and the lingering presence of the past. After the gathering, I returned to the quiet of my cottage with a deep sense of both melancholy and hope. The voices I had heard, the items I had uncovered, and the shared stories of neighbors had coalesced into a singular understanding. The cottage was not haunted in the way that horror movies depict, but rather it was alive with memory. Every creak of the floor, every unexpected knock at the door, and every soft whisper in the wind was a reminder that time does not simply fade away. It lingers in the spaces we leave behind. In the following weeks, I redoubled my efforts to document these phenomena. I set up a small recorder on the porch to capture any sounds that might occur in the quiet hours of the night, and I began to photograph every detail that caught my attention. A glimpse of a shadow in the corner of a window, the faint outline of a figure in the moonlight, the intricate patterns of frost on an old mirror. I reviewed the recordings with a blend of scientific skepticism and emotional openness, noting that sometimes the sounds were almost musical, as if they were recitations of an old, sorrowful hymn. I transcribed snippets of what I thought might be words, though the language was too archaic to be immediately understood. I began to wonder if these were not random noises at all, but rather deliberate communications, a dialogue between the past and the present, reaching out from the depths of memory. Winter brought its own quiet transformation to the Piedmont. The vibrant greens of summer softened into muted hues of brown and gray, and the chill in the air was palpable, even in the gentle, overcast light. Yet life in the cottage continued in its steady, unhurried rhythm. I spent my mornings by the small wood stove, reading the letters I had found and piecing together the stories they told. I found solace in the idea that the lives of those who had once filled this space were not lost, but preserved in these fragile documents, and in the lingering echoes of their presence. In the afternoons, I would venture out on long walks through the surrounding hills, always carrying my journal and a sense of curiosity that never waned. I sometimes felt that, in those solitary moments, I was accompanied by unseen companions, whispers of voices that urged me to remember, to write, to understand. One particularly clear evening, when the sky was heavy with stars and the cool air carried the promise of an impending frost, I sat on the porch writing by the light of an oil lamp. The silence was deep, interrupted only by the occasional hoot of an owl and the soft rustling of wind through the trees. I remember a moment when I felt a presence so palpable that I could almost see it, a gentle, luminescent figure, standing just at the edge of the light, watching silently. I did not speak. I did not run. Instead, I simply acknowledged the presence, writing down my sensations and emotions in long, reflective sentences. It was as if that moment, though brief, had bridged the gap between my solitary existence and the collective memory of the past. I wondered if this was what it meant to truly inhabit a place, a perpetual dialogue between the living and the departed, a constant negotiation of sorrow and healing. As time passed, I began to integrate the relics of the past into my everyday life. I placed the brass key in a small glass case on a shelf in the main room of the cottage, a silent talisman that reminded me of the secrets the land held. I kept the old photographs and letters in a special drawer, sometimes taking them out to review and reflect on the stories they contained. I even started composing a series of essays that wove together the historical accounts I had uncovered with my own personal experiences. The creaks of the old floorboards, the unexpected knocks at the door, the soft hum of voices that sometimes rose in the still of night. Each essay was a piece of the mosaic I was assembling, a living testament to the interplay between memory, myth, and the passage of time. One day, while rummaging through a stack of old newspapers at the local library, I discovered an article about a tragic event that had taken place in the area over a century ago, a fire that had claimed the lives of several members of a well-known local family. The article was brief and factual, lacking any of the poignant detail that would be expected given the loss. Yet, it mentioned that some believed the family's spirit had lingered long after the tragedy. I felt a chill reading those lines, as if the words themselves carried the weight of a long-held sorrow. I copied the article's text into my journal, and later that evening read it aloud on the porch. In the quiet, cool air, my voice mingled with the soft sounds of the night, and for a moment I felt as though I were conversing with the past, a shared lament that transcended time. The following months brought a deepening of my understanding and acceptance of the cottage's peculiar, haunting nature. I no longer felt the need to chase every mysterious sound or shadow. Instead, I allowed the strange and inexplicable to become part of the tapestry of my life here. I continued to write, to document, and to honor the memories that seemed to seep from the very walls of the cottage. In the process, I discovered a healing that was as gradual as it was profound. My grief, once so overwhelming, softened into a reflective melancholy, a quiet sorrow that was tempered by the beauty of remembrance. I realized that by embracing the relics of the past, the letters, the photographs, the whispered voices, I was not allowing the memories to haunt me, but rather letting them guide me toward a deeper understanding of who I was and who I might become. Now, as I sit at my desk in the soft glow of a single lamp, the night outside is calm and filled with a gentle hush. I can still hear the faint knock at the wall from time to time, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the light. But these moments no longer fill me with terror. Instead, they serve as quiet reminders of the lives that came before me, of the enduring presence of memory, and of the quiet, unspoken conversation that continues between the past and the present. I have come to believe that this cottage, with its weathered boards and silent relics, is more than just a shelter. It is a living chronicle of the people who once called this land home. It is a space where sorrow and hope, loss and healing coexist in a delicate balance. Every object I have found, every story shared by the locals, has added to the rich mosaic of memory that I am privileged to witness and record. In writing these stories and preserving these relics, I am participating in a tradition that stretches back through time, a tradition that reminds us that our lives are part of a larger, ongoing narrative, a narrative where every whisper, every knock at the door, and every faded photograph is a testament to the enduring power of memory. As the seasons continue their slow, inevitable cycle, I remain committed to this life of quiet reflection and respectful inquiry. I continue to meet with Diane, who offers gentle counsel and shares her own insights drawn from a lifetime spent in these hills. We often walk together along the narrow trails that wind through the woods, our conversations meandering from practical matters to the deep, sometimes ineffable questions about the nature of memory and legacy. It is in these moments, under the vast, unending sky of the Blue Ridge, that I feel truly at home, a place where every creak of the old house, every subtle shift in the wind, carries a story waiting to be told. I know there will always be nights when the mysteries of the past stir, and the gentle knocking on the walls resumes, a soft reminder that I am not alone in this place, that the ghosts of history continue to speak, and rather than shun these moments, I have learned to embrace them as part of the natural order, as integral threads in the tapestry of life, in the quiet interplay of loss and hope, of memory and renewal. I have found my calling, a commitment to preserve not only the tangible relics of a bygone era, but also the intangible spirit that lingers in the air. This is my story, a chronicle of a journey from the relentless pace of urban life to the gentle, enduring embrace of the Blue Ridge. It is a narrative written in quiet moments and hushed whispers, in the soft rustle of leaves and the steady beat of a resilient heart. And, as I continue to write and to listen, I remain ever mindful that every echo of the past holds within it the promise of healing, the spark of new beginnings, and the enduring beauty of a life lived in harmony with both history and the natural world. I arrived at the coastal redwoods near Santa Cruz with a mix of determination and quiet trepidation, a resolve to leave behind the frenetic pulse of city life in search of a refuge where art and nature could intertwine. My name is Nina Alvarez, and I had grown tired of a world that valued productivity over beauty. In the urban sprawl, I'd long felt my creative spirit stifled, so I set out on a journey to reconnect with something older, more enduring than the transient chaos of modern existence. My destination was an off-grid cabin tucked into the heart of a towering redwood grove, a place where the fog moves slowly among ancient giants, and where every breath feels saturated with centuries of whispered lore. The drive along the coastal highway was surreal. The gray, rolling hills gave way to expansive groves of redwoods, their colossal trunks rising majestically toward a sky that often shifted between soft gold and a silvery haze. I remember watching the coastline slip by in the rearview mirror, the ocean's gentle murmur mingling with the rustle of coastal wind, as if nature itself were composing a quiet symphony just for me. When I finally pulled up at the cabin, a modest, weathered structure hidden behind a screen of ferns and moss, I felt as though I were entering a secret world. The cabin's exterior, clad in peeling cedar siding and accented with rusted metal fixtures, blended almost magically with the forest. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, damp air fill my lungs, and I stepped out into a realm where time seemed both suspended and in constant motion. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in the practical work of settling in. I inspected the old solar panels mounted on the sloping roof, patched up gaps in the wooden walls, and rearranged a few handmade furnishings to create a small studio near a window that overlooked the dense, fog-laden forest. There was no luxury here, just a simple, rhythmic existence punctuated by the sounds of nature. I began each day with the ritual of watching sunlight filter through the towering redwoods, their massive crowns lost in the ever-present coastal fog, and ended each night with a quiet reflection by the gentle glow of an oil lamp. This was a life stripped down to its essentials, where every inconvenience was balanced by a natural beauty that was raw and unfiltered. Yet, even in this peaceful isolation, strange occurrences began to weave themselves into my daily routine. It started with subtle details, a pattern in the fog that seemed to shift in the distance, almost resembling a face that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on it. One early evening, as I was setting up my easel outside to capture the interplay of light and shadow on the forest floor, I noticed that the gentle fog was behaving oddly. Instead of its usual, undulating motion, the mist appeared to coalesce into distinct shapes for a few moments before dissolving into its featureless mass. I chalked it up to my tired eyes playing tricks on me at first, but as the nights grew longer and the experiences repeated, I couldn't dismiss the feeling that the redwoods were trying to communicate in a language beyond words. On another occasion, while gathering firewood along a narrow trail that meandered through clusters of ferns and moss, I heard a series of soft, measured footsteps echoing on the damp forest floor. I paused, heart pounding, straining to listen in the heavy silence of the grove. The sound was unmistakably human, yet there was an eerie quality to it, as though the steps were both deliberate and insubstantial, like the echo of a presence that existed only in memory. I searched for the source, following the trail of sound for several tense minutes, but each time I turned a corner, the footsteps would vanish without a trace. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving only a lingering uncertainty in the air. My sense of unease deepened further when I began to notice peculiar markings carved into the bark of the redwoods. One afternoon, while I was hiking along a well-worn path near the edge of my property, I came upon a tree whose trunk bore a series of intricate symbols. The carvings were not random scratches. They had a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality, and under the fading light, they seemed to pulse with a subtle luminescence. I traced my fingers over the grooves, feeling a strange vibration beneath my skin. The symbols, I later learned from local lore, were thought to be an ancient form of communication, an offering to the guardian spirits of the forest, or perhaps a plea for protection from forces beyond human control. I documented the markings with careful photographs and detailed sketches in my journal, determined to decode their meaning in my own time. In my quest to understand these odd happenings, I sought out the guidance of Eli, a park ranger whose quiet wisdom and deep connection to the redwoods had earned him a near-mythical reputation among locals. We met one overcast afternoon on a narrow trail that wound its way to a clearing where the fog lifted to reveal a breathtaking vista of the forest canopy. Eli was a man of few words, his rugged face weathered by years spent in the wild, yet his eyes held an intensity that spoke of a profound understanding of these ancient trees. I told him about the shifting patterns in the fog, the echoing footsteps, and especially the mysterious symbols etched into the bark of the redwoods. He listened quietly, nodding as if he'd heard similar stories before. "These woods have always been alive with secrets," he said softly. "The redwoods are more than just trees. They're guardians of memory. Sometimes they speak in symbols and shadows, if you're willing to listen." His words, delivered in a low, measured tone, lent both credence and comfort to my mounting uncertainties. With Eli's encouragement, I began to explore the local Native American legends that surrounded the redwood groves. I visited small libraries in nearby towns and pored over books and articles on indigenous folklore. I learned of guardian spirits said to inhabit the ancient trees, beings who watched over the forest and safeguarded its secrets. According to some of these accounts, the redwoods were not merely natural wonders, but living monuments imbued with the wisdom of generations. Their bark, etched with the memory of time, carried symbols that were believed to be expressions of the land's enduring spirit. I was fascinated and, admittedly, a little unnerved by the idea that these immense trees could hold within them a consciousness that reached out to those who dwelled among them. My nightly routine took on a new significance as I began to incorporate these discoveries into my daily life. I started to set up a small altar on a sturdy table near the cabin's front window, a simple arrangement of handmade art pieces, small tokens of nature like smooth pebbles and fragments of driftwood, and even a few carefully inscribed pieces of paper where I recorded my thoughts and questions. With Eli's occasional visits for advice and my own solitary hours of contemplation, I found myself engaging in quiet rituals that felt both personal and profoundly connected to the land. Some nights, as the fog rolled in thickly and the redwoods stood silent and solemn, I would recite short phrases from old indigenous chants I'd learned during my research. My voice, soft and tentative at first, grew more confident with each passing day. It was as though I were establishing a conversation with the forest, a dialogue in which every whispered syllable was an offering, and every rustle of leaves a gentle reply. The beauty of the coastal redwoods was both awe-inspiring and humbling. Every day, as I rose with the mist and walked among the towering giants, I was struck by the sense of timelessness that permeated the grove. The light, filtering through the fog, transformed the world into a soft palette of reds, oranges, and deep greens, and I often lost myself in the interplay of shadow and illumination. I spent hours painting and sketching in the open air, trying to capture not just the physical forms of the trees, but the intangible aura of mystery that clung to them. My art became a bridge between my internal world and the vast, ineffable energy of the forest, a medium through which I could express both my awe and my apprehension. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the seasons shifted imperceptibly, the signs of the forest's mysterious influence grew ever more pronounced. On several occasions, while I was alone in the cabin during the twilight hours, I detected soft echoes, footsteps that seemed to fall in a measured rhythm along the forest floor, even though no one else was there. At times, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved with a deliberate grace, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. In one particularly striking instance, I awoke to find that a series of strange symbols had appeared on a large redwood trunk near my cabin. They glowed faintly in the dusk light, almost as if the tree itself were alive with a secret message. I spent a long time examining the symbols, comparing them with the ones I had seen earlier, and began to suspect that they were part of a larger, ancient language, a code left by the guardians of the forest to communicate with those who had the sensitivity to understand. The deeper I delved into these mysteries, the more I found that the boundary between my inner world and the wild realm around me was growing thinner. My nights became a tapestry of vivid dreams and subtle awakenings. I would sometimes find myself wandering through the grove in a trance-like state, my footsteps light on the soft, mossy ground, as if I were being led by an unseen hand. In these moments, the line between waking and dreaming blurred, and I could almost hear the voices of the redwoods, a slow, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath my feet. The experience was at once disconcerting and deeply moving, a reminder that I was part of something far greater than my own solitary existence. One autumn evening stands out in my memory as a turning point in my journey. The air was cool, and the fog had settled in thick layers around the trunks of the redwoods, shrouding the forest in an ethereal glow. I sat on the porch of the cabin with a cup of tea, watching as the mist moved in slow, graceful swirls. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of an old branch or the distant call of a seabird from the coast. Then, as if summoned by my quiet contemplation, a soft series of footsteps approached from the edge of the grove. I could not see a face, only a vague, shifting silhouette against the fog, but the presence was undeniable. My heart pounded in my chest, not out of fear, but of an overwhelming sense of connection, as if this spectral visitor were a messenger from the ancient past. I sat there, motionless, allowing the moment to imprint itself on my memory. When the figure finally receded into the mist, I felt that a silent conversation had taken place, a shared understanding that transcended the boundaries of time and language. In the weeks and months that followed, I continued my dual quest for artistic expression and spiritual understanding. I documented every encounter, every shifting shadow, and every strange symbol in my journal and through my paintings. I began to host small gatherings in the cabin's modest studio, inviting a few fellow artists and local friends to share in the experience of the redwoods. We would spend evenings beneath the low-hanging fog, our voices mingling with the rustling leaves, as we recited traditional songs and exchanged personal stories of loss, hope, and the ineffable beauty of the natural world. These gatherings were intimate and unpretentious, moments of collective vulnerability that deepened my belief that the forest's mysterious energies were not malevolent, but rather a profound expression of life's enduring cycles. Eli continued to be a steady presence throughout my time here, offering his quiet insights and sharing anecdotes about the ancient legends of the redwoods. In one conversation that I recall vividly, he spoke of a tradition among local indigenous communities, in which art was seen as a bridge between the visible and the invisible realms. "The trees remember," he said, his voice low and measured, "and they speak through the symbols you see, the patterns you capture on canvas. It is not mere coincidence that you feel drawn to these mysteries. It is the call of the land itself, inviting you to become part of its story." His words resonated with me, and I began to understand that my journey here was not an escape from the past, but an embrace of a legacy that had been waiting patiently to be rediscovered. As winter gave way to the gentle renewal of spring, the coastal redwoods revealed themselves in ever more intricate detail. The fog thinned during the day, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate the towering trees and cast deep, shifting shadows on the forest floor. In these moments of clarity, I would wander the grove for hours, photographing the interplay of light and leaf, and allowing the natural beauty to fill me with a sense of wonder and gratitude. Yet, even in the brightness of a spring morning, the mysteries lingered, etched into the bark of the redwoods, whispered by the wind, and carried in the quiet footsteps of unseen visitors. Now, as I sit in the warm glow of a late afternoon and listen to the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, I find that the redwoods have become both a mirror and a muse for my soul. Every day here is a dialogue between the past and the present, a subtle, ongoing conversation in which the language of the forest is written in symbols, shadows, and the ephemeral dance of fog and light. I have come to realize that my art and my writing are not merely acts of creation, but acts of remembrance, ways of honoring the enduring spirit of the land and the countless lives that have been intertwined with these ancient giants. I remain committed to this path, a dual quest of artistic creation and spiritual understanding. I continue to record my experiences, not with the cold detachment of a scientist, but with the warm, unguarded honesty of someone who has allowed the natural world to seep into every corner of her being. I host gatherings, share my paintings, and write long, unfiltered essays that blend personal memoir with folklore, all in an effort to capture the delicate interplay of beauty and mystery that defines life here among the coastal redwoods. There are nights when the fog rolls in so thickly that the world becomes a soft, indistinct blur, a place where the boundaries between the physical and the ethereal dissolve into a gentle, perpetual murmur. In those moments, I feel the presence of something ancient and benevolent, as though the redwoods themselves are reaching out to comfort me, to remind me that even in solitude there is companionship, and in mystery there is a promise of renewal. I have learned that every symbol carved into the bark, every soft echo of footsteps on the forest floor, carries with it a piece of a larger, ineffable truth, a truth that transcends the confines of language and time, resonating in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. I know now that my journey is far from over. Each day in this place, beneath the vast, watchful canopy of redwoods, and amidst the ever-changing play of fog and light, deepens my understanding of what it means to truly live with an open heart. The cabin, with its humble walls and timeless presence, has become a sanctuary not only for my art, but for my soul, a place where the legacy of the past is honored, and where every encounter with the mysterious is a gentle reminder that life is an ongoing dialogue between memory and hope. As I write these words, the soft hum of the redwoods and the quiet, shifting patterns of the fog form a living backdrop, a perpetual inspiration that guides my hand and steadies my mind. I am Nina Alvarez, an environmental artist and seeker of hidden truths, and I have found in these ancient groves a home, a muse, and a constant invitation to explore the delicate balance between the known and the unknown. Here, in the embrace of the coastal redwoods, I continue to learn, to create, and to listen to the language of the land, to the whispers of those who came before, and to the quiet, enduring pulse of a life lived in harmony with nature. I never imagined that the desert would become both my refuge and my greatest source of mystery. My name is Jordan Rivera, and I once prided myself on being a firm believer in science, a geologist and amateur photographer whose worldview was built entirely on facts, measurements, and the quiet certainty of physical laws. But after years of being trapped in a corporate job that stifled my creativity and drained my spirit, I finally reached a breaking point. I craved inspiration, a new beginning away from the suffocating hum of city life, and something in me whispered that the rugged landscape of Sedona, Arizona, held secrets that could reawaken my soul. So I left behind the sterile confines of boardrooms and endless cubicles, and set out to build an off-grid adobe retreat on the red-hued hills outside Sedona, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe ancient energy. The journey to my new home was an awakening in itself. As I drove through the vast desert, the horizon stretched endlessly before me, a canvas painted in deep reds and burnt oranges. The sun, relentless in its brilliance, scorched the cracked earth, while distant mesas and buttes jutted upward like the remnants of a forgotten civilization. I remember pulling over at a lookout point, stepping out of the car, and feeling the heat radiate from the land. It was both intimidating and invigorating. The desert demanded respect, and I welcomed that challenge. My new adobe retreat was modest but full of character. Constructed with sun-baked bricks and built into the side of a hill, the home blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. I spent the first few days renovating and personalizing the space, patching up cracks in the walls, repainting the interior in soft, neutral tones, and setting up a small studio where I could develop my photographs. Solar panels adorned the roof, a testament to my commitment to living off the grid, even as they struggled at times under the relentless sun. I also installed a rainwater collection system, though the sporadic desert rains made that a constant challenge. The isolation was exhilarating. Every morning I woke to a panorama of red rock formations and sweeping vistas that no one else could ever claim as their own. It wasn't long before I discovered that this place was more than just a pretty face. On my very first night in the desert, as twilight descended and the scorching heat gave way to a bone-chilling cold, I found myself sitting on the worn wooden steps of my porch, a cup of weak coffee warming my hands. The sky exploded with stars, a brilliance that dwarfed anything I'd ever seen in the city. In that stillness, the silence of the desert was punctuated by a subtle, almost imperceptible murmur. At first, I dismissed it as the wind weaving through the crevices of my adobe walls, but as I listened more closely, it sounded oddly rhythmic, like a chant from a language I didn't know, a murmur that seemed to echo from the very rocks themselves. The following morning, I set out with my camera, determined to capture the desert's raw beauty, and, perhaps, the source of that strange sound. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with vast expanses of red sandstone punctuated by sparse clusters of scrub oak and yucca. I wandered through narrow canyons and along rocky trails, snapping photos of curious formations and patterns in the earth. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something unsettling. There were markings on the rocks that hadn't been there before, or at least that I hadn't seen. At first, I assumed they were natural weathering or the result of erosion, but closer inspection revealed them to be deliberate carvings, etched into the stone in a series of symbols that seemed to shift in appearance as I moved. It was as if the carvings were alive, their forms subtly altering with the play of light and shadow. That evening, I returned to my retreat with my mind buzzing with questions. I loaded my camera with fresh film and began to review the images I'd taken, hoping that the truth would reveal itself in the details. At first glance, the photographs were stunning, sharp, vivid details of the red rock and endless sky. But then I noticed something I couldn't explain. In several shots, barely visible in the background, were figures that resembled human silhouettes. They were not clear or defined, just faint outlines that seemed to hover among the rocks. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if my imagination was playing tricks on me in the fading light. Yet, when I zoomed in on the images, the forms persisted. Shadowy shapes that had no logical explanation. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mix of excitement and dread stirring in my chest. Determined to make sense of these inexplicable occurrences, I reached out to Mia, a free-spirited artist and longtime friend who had always been fascinated by the mystical qualities of the desert. Mia had moved to Sedona several years earlier, drawn by the vibrant energy and the rich tapestry of Native American lore that permeated the region. When I told her about the carvings and the ghostly figures in my photographs, her eyes lit up with a mix of curiosity and concern. She insisted that I visit a local shaman she knew, a quiet, enigmatic man who had spent decades studying the ancient traditions of the Navajo and Hopi peoples. He was said to possess knowledge of the desert's hidden forces, including the legends of skinwalkers and desert spirits. Though skeptical by nature, I agreed that perhaps a broader perspective was needed. After all, I was beginning to question the limits of my own rationality. A week later, Mia and I drove together along a dusty, winding road toward a small, unassuming settlement where the shaman lived. The journey took us deep into the heart of the desert, far from the tourist traps and commercialized spirituality that often characterized Sedona's outskirts. The air was dry, and the heat shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. At last, we arrived at a humble dwelling made of adobe and wood, set against the backdrop of towering red rocks. The shaman, a quiet, weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, greeted us with a nod. Over a simple meal of corn and beans, he listened intently as Mia and I recounted the strange events at my retreat, the shifting carvings, the whispering winds, and the shadowy figures in my photographs. He spoke in measured tones, his voice low and resonant, explaining that the desert was a living, breathing entity with its own memory. According to him, the land had been witness to countless rituals, sacrifices, and acts of love and violence, and its spirit was both guardian and avenger. He mentioned that skinwalkers, shapeshifters of Native American lore, were said to roam these barren lands, taking on forms that could blur the line between man and beast. They were believed to be creatures of both protection and malevolence, drawn to the energy of the land and the emotions of those who dwelled upon it. The shaman warned me that I might have inadvertently disturbed a sacred balance by settling in an area where the old ways still resonated strongly. He suggested that the shifting symbols on the rocks were perhaps messages, warnings or invitations from the spirit world, and that the ghostly figures in my photographs were not merely hallucinations of light and shadow, but glimpses into another realm. I left the shaman's dwelling with a heavy mind and an even heavier heart. His words mingled with my own scientific skepticism, challenging me to consider that perhaps the desert was far more mysterious than I had ever allowed myself to believe. That night, as I sat on the worn wooden steps of my adobe retreat, the desert sky unfurled above me in a tapestry of shimmering stars, and I listened again to the murmuring wind. It was almost as if the rocks themselves were speaking, their voices blending with the rustle of the sparse vegetation. I wondered if the carvings would change again by morning, if the spectral figures would become clearer or vanish entirely. Sleep eluded me, and in the darkness I felt as though I were suspended between two worlds, the one of hard, unyielding geology, and the other of ethereal myth. Over the following weeks, the phenomena grew increasingly persistent and, at times, aggressive. I began to notice that the eerie carvings on the rocks were not static. They shifted gradually, sometimes aligning in patterns that resembled ancient script, other times breaking apart into chaotic, almost desperate shapes. I took to recording these changes in a leather-bound journal, sketching the symbols by hand and annotating each detail with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Every time I ventured out with my camera, I felt that I was being drawn into a silent dialogue with the desert, a conversation that I struggled to understand but could not ignore. The nights, however, were when the true terror began. One evening, after a particularly sweltering day when the heat had warped the air into a shimmering haze, I returned to my retreat to find the temperature had plunged abruptly. The desert, known for its dramatic swings between scorching day and frigid night, seemed even more unpredictable now. I sat on my back porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to quell the chill that had seeped into my bones. The wind carried with it a series of low, guttural sounds, a deep, almost rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. It wasn't the whisper of the wind, but a sound that resonated in my chest, a call that felt both ancient and urgent. I tried to rationalize it away as nothing more than a natural phenomenon, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, as night deepened. I stepped inside, turning on every light I had, but the darkness outside seemed to press in on the windows, as if daring me to look. With trembling hands, I drew back the curtains and peered out into the desert night. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement. Shadows flitting among the rocks, figures that moved in the periphery of my vision. I couldn't tell if they were real or illusions conjured by my fevered imagination, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I confided in Mia, who had become my confidant and partner in unraveling the mysteries of this harsh land. Over a late-night phone call filled with static and the sound of wind, I recounted every detail. The shifting carvings, the ghostly figures, the eerie pulse of the earth. Mia's voice was a mixture of excitement and concern. She admitted that she too had experienced moments of inexplicable dread, a feeling that something in the desert was trying to communicate, to warn us of an ancient force stirred by our intrusion. Together, we decided to take our investigation further. We set up a series of motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of my retreat, aiming them at the rock faces where the carvings were most prominent, and along the trails where the spectral figures were rumored to appear. We also began keeping detailed logs of any anomalies, noting the time, weather conditions, and our own emotional states. The first few nights of surveillance produced nothing more than ordinary desert scenes. A tumbleweed rolling across the red sand, the quiet rustle of brush, the steady pulse of the wind. But on the fourth night, as I reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. One camera, pointed at a particularly prominent rock outcrop, had captured a series of inexplicable events. In the early hours before dawn, the rock's surface seemed to ripple, and the carvings rearranged themselves in a fluid, almost living manner. Then, in a shadow that did not belong to the rock, a figure emerged, a blurry, humanoid shape with elongated limbs and eyes that glinted like distant stars. The figure lingered for a few long seconds before dissolving into the darkness. I rewound the footage repeatedly, desperate to catch every detail, and each time the image seemed to shift imperceptibly, as if trying to hide its true nature. I showed the footage to Mia the next day, and though she tried to maintain her composure, I could hear the tremor in her voice as she insisted that we needed to understand what we were dealing with. That afternoon, we returned to the shaman's dwelling. The old man listened silently as we described the latest occurrences, nodding slowly as if confirming something he had known all along. He explained that the desert was a place where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was particularly thin, a place where the souls of ancient ones could still roam. He mentioned that the Skinwalkers, creatures of shifting form and elusive presence, were often blamed for such phenomena. According to legend, these beings could mimic the appearance of humans, even the features of those who once walked these lands, as a way of luring unsuspecting souls into the embrace of the desert's dark side. His words, delivered in a measured cadence, filled me with both dread and a strange sense of inevitability. He advised us to perform a cleansing ritual, a rite that involved burning sage, sprinkling salt around the retreat, and reciting prayers in the ancient tongue of the local tribes. He promised that this might pacify the restless energies, if only for a while. Mia and I returned to my retreat that evening with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Under the vast, star-studded sky, we gathered the ritual items and arranged them carefully on the weathered wooden table in my living room. The night air was cool, and the desert seemed to hold its breath as we began the incantation. I recited the words as best I could from memory, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides, while Mia waved bundles of sage over the adobe walls. For a moment, the desert fell silent, as though the ancient forces were listening. Then, slowly, a gentle wind stirred, carrying with it a sense of calm that had been absent for so many nights. We believed that we had, if only temporarily, restored some measure of balance to the land. Yet, even as the ritual concluded, I knew that the desert's mysteries were not so easily tamed. In the days that followed, the strange phenomena resumed with renewed vigor. The rock carvings continued to shift, and on several occasions I caught a glimpse of that elusive figure on the edges of my vision, always in the periphery, never fully in focus. The whispering winds returned, now sounding almost like faint, rhythmic chants that ebbed and flowed with the passing hours. At times, I felt a palpable pressure in the air, as if something was trying to push its way into my retreat. The nights grew longer, and with each passing one, the sense of being intruded upon by unseen presences became harder to ignore. Mia and I spent countless hours poring over the footage, trying to find a pattern or meaning in the chaotic images. We debated fiercely about whether the phenomena were real or the result of overactive imaginations exacerbated by isolation and the harsh environment. I began to document everything in a journal, a detailed account of every sound, every flicker of light, every inexplicable movement. The journal became both a scientific log and a personal testament to my struggle to understand a world that seemed to defy the logic I had once held dear. There were nights when sleep eluded me entirely, and I would lie awake in the darkness, the silence punctuated only by the distant murmur of the desert. In those moments, I felt a deep, almost overwhelming connection to the land, a sense that I was a part of something vast, timeless, and not entirely benign. The boundaries between the physical and the spiritual blurred, and I wondered if perhaps my scientific mind was being forced to confront truths that lay beyond the reach of empirical understanding. As the weeks turned into months, the desert began to reveal its dual nature to me, a harsh, unforgiving landscape that was also inexplicably beautiful and full of hidden wonder. I captured thousands of photographs, the play of light on ancient rock, the eerie silhouettes of the elusive figures, and the delicate interplay of shadow and color that transformed the barren earth into a living work of art. Each image was a reminder that, despite the terror I sometimes felt, there was a profound beauty in the chaos, a beauty that demanded both reverence and caution. Mia remained my constant companion and confidant throughout this journey, her free spirit and artistic vision helping to anchor me in moments of overwhelming uncertainty. Together, we held long conversations beneath the expansive desert sky, debating the nature of the unseen forces that haunted the land. She was unafraid to embrace the mystical, to see the intangible threads that connected the present to an ancient past, while I struggled to reconcile my scientific training with the undeniable evidence of the inexplicable. Our late-night walks became a ritual in themselves, as we followed the shifting shadows along narrow trails, occasionally stumbling upon hidden symbols carved into rocks, or finding small tokens left by unknown hands. These moments, though filled with a palpable sense of dread, also carried the promise of discovery, a promise that by understanding the mysteries of the desert, we might unlock secrets that had been buried for millennia. There were times when the encounters became so aggressive that I found myself questioning my decision to come here. One particularly sweltering night, as the temperature dipped unexpectedly and the stars emerged with an almost supernatural clarity, I heard a sound that shattered the fragile peace of my retreat. It began as a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the adobe walls, growing louder and more insistent until it seemed to come from every corner of the room. I bolted upright, heart hammering, as the sound reached a fever pitch. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the unmistakable echo of footsteps and distant, anguished cries. I rushed to the window, and in the flickering light of my security lamp, I saw a dark shape moving swiftly across the rocky outcrop. For a moment, it paused, its eyes, if they could be called that, glinting in the harsh light, before disappearing into the endless darkness of the desert. I spent the rest of the night huddled beneath layers of blankets, too terrified to sleep, convinced that something malevolent was trying to force its way into my sanctuary. In the aftermath of that night, Mia and I resolved that we could no longer simply wait for the phenomena to subside. We began to document our experiences in a more systematic fashion, setting up additional cameras and even an audio recorder to capture the subtle, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to accompany the mysterious sounds. We reached out to a few local experts, archaeologists, folklorists, and even a couple of skeptical academics who had studied the legends of the desert. While none could offer a definitive explanation, their collective insights lent weight to the idea that what we were experiencing was a convergence of ancient energy and modern intrusion. The desert, it seemed, was a place where the old ways still had power, where the spirits of long-forgotten peoples and creatures could stir in response to the presence of those who dared to disturb the delicate balance. As I sat here now, in the quiet solitude of another desert night, I can still hear the distant murmur of shifting stones and whispered voices carried on the wind. The red rocks glow softly in the pale light of the moon, and I know that the mysteries of this land are far from solved. I remain here, driven by a determination to understand and perhaps even document the inexplicable, a scientist and an artist, bound together by a shared desire to reveal the hidden depths of a world that defies simple explanation. Each day brings new revelations, and with them, new questions. But I have come to accept that in the desert, not everything is meant to be understood by the logic of reason alone. I am no longer sure whether the shadowy figures I capture with my camera are the mere trick of light and sand, or if they are real, spectral beings from an ancient past. I have learned that the desert has its own language, a language spoken in shifting symbols and whispered chants, in the timeless dance between light and darkness. And though fear still grips me on certain nights, there is also a profound sense of wonder, a recognition that I have found a place where the past and the present converge, where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blur into a continuum of beauty and mystery. Mia's presence has been a constant source of solace and insight. Together, we continue to explore the secrets of this land, unraveling its myths and documenting its hidden voices. We hold on to the hope that by understanding the energy of the desert, we might one day unlock its stories and share them with a world that is too busy to listen. For now, I remain here in Sedona, an imperfect sanctuary of adobe and sun, rock and shadow, determined to honor the land's ancient power and to forge a future built on both science and the mystical, a future where the shadows over Sedona are not feared, but understood as part of the vast, eternal tapestry of existence. I have learned that inspiration often comes at a price paid in sleepless nights, in moments of terror when the unseen nearly overpowers the rational mind. Yet, I have also learned that the desert, with all its harsh beauty and enigmatic power, can heal even the most fractured soul. I am Jordan Rivera, and I have come to believe that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only experienced and revered. As I continue my work here, I know that I will forever be changed by the whispers and the shadows, by the shifting carvings in the red rocks, and the spectral figures that dance in the periphery of my vision. And in that transformation, I find a strange and enduring hope, a hope that, even in a world of relentless logic, there is room for wonder, for mystery, and for the wild, untamed spirit of the desert.